Tonight, we travel beyond its broken highways and silent skyscrapers, past the shores of a shattered America, and across the vast oceans that once connected nations. The Great War did not end at one coastline. It did not spare distant capitals or quiet villages. Across Europe, across Asia, across deserts and tundras, the sky burned the same. As you rest, we will drift through those forgotten lands and gently explore what became of the rest of the world. Long before the sirens wailed and the skies ignited, the world beyond America was already trembling under the strain of its own hunger. The decades leading to the Great War were not marked by sudden catastrophe, but by a slow tightening of pressure, like a machine pushed beyond its limits. Oil fields ran dry, supply chains faltered, nations that had once traded freely began to look inward, guarding what little remained. The modern world, built on fossil fuels and constant expansion, found itself confronting the reality of exhaustion. In the early years of the 21st century, petroleum shortages became more than an economic inconvenience. They reshaped global politics. Countries that had once depended on imported fuel faced blackouts and industrial decline. Transportation networks slowed, food prices rose, protests filled city streets from continent to continent. Energy had always been the invisible lifeblood of modern civilization, and without it, every system began to stutter. The United Nations, once a symbol of fragile cooperation, struggled to mediate escalating disputes. By the middle of the century, its authority weakened under the weight of competing national interests. In the year 2052, the organization formally dissolved. Its collapse did not cause the crisis, but it marked a turning point. Without even the illusion of global unity, alliances hardened into rival blocs. In Europe, nations facing energy scarcity chose consolidation over competition. The European Commonwealth formed as an economic and military alliance, an attempt to pool dwindling resources and present a unified front. At first, the Union promised stability. Shared infrastructure and coordinated defense seemed practical in an era of scarcity. Yet unity, born of fear, rarely remains gentle. As shortages deepened, the Commonwealth turned outward in search of oil. The Middle East, long the center of global petroleum production, became the focal point of this desperation. Tensions between European forces and regional powers escalated into open conflict. What began as resource disputes transformed into sustained warfare. Conventional battles ravaged oil fields and cities alike. Eventually, nuclear weapons were deployed in limited exchanges, scorching portions of the region decades before the Great War that would later engulf the globe. Entire landscapes were rendered inhospitable, their skies permanently hazed by fallout and smoke. While Europe fought in the deserts, unrest simmered within its own borders. Economic strain fueled riots, governments rationed food and energy. Civil liberties narrowed in the name of stability. The Commonwealth that had formed to protect its members gradually fractured under the very pressures it sought to contain. By the time hostilities in the Middle East subsided, Europe itself was weakened, its unity brittle, and its population weary. Across the Pacific, China faced its own crisis. Industrial expansion had strained its energy reserves, and internal shortages threatened social order. The Chinese government pursued aggressive measures to secure remaining resources, including expansionist policies that would bring it into direct conflict with the United States. As global trade contracted and alliances collapsed, suspicion replaced diplomacy. The United States, though technologically advanced, was not immune to the crisis. Domestic resource depletion forced it to guard its remaining oil reserves fiercely. It annexed Canada to secure supply lines and maintain access to Alaskan resources. Military presence expanded. Propaganda intensified. The line between economic survival and militarization blurred until it vanished entirely. The world economy, once interconnected through trade routes and shared markets, began to fragment into isolated spheres. Shipping lanes grew dangerous. Piracy increased as desperate groups targeted dwindling cargo shipments. Air travel declined as fuel became too precious to waste. Even communication infrastructure suffered. Satellites and data networks, though still operational, increasingly served military priorities rather than civilian exchange. In many regions, authoritarian governance strengthened as leaders promised security in exchange for obedience. Surveillance expanded. Dissent was suppressed. Citizens learned to accept rationing as normal. The comforts of the late 20th century faded into memory, replaced by a quieter, more controlled existence shaped by scarcity. Technological advancement did not halt during this period, but it shifted focus. Nuclear energy, once controversial, became central to national survival strategies. Countries invested heavily in reactors, fusion research, and alternative power systems. Robotics and automation advanced as labor shortages and unrest made human workforces unpredictable. Artificial intelligence systems managed logistics and defense networks with increasing autonomy. Yet, beneath these innovations lay a shared vulnerability. The world had become more advanced, but also more fragile. Supply chains depended on precision. Energy grids required constant maintenance. Governments relied on centralized control systems. A single disruption could cascade outward, affecting millions. By the time open war erupted between the United States and China over Anchorage and the remaining oil reserves, the planet was already exhausted. The Sino-American conflict was not an isolated struggle, but the culmination of decades of scarcity and fear. Other nations watched uneasily, aware that any escalation between the two superpowers would have consequences far beyond their borders. Throughout these years, ordinary people attempted to live as they always had. Families gathered for meals under rationed lights. Children attended schools that taught them loyalty and preparedness. Entertainment persisted, though increasingly shaped by patriotic themes. Beneath the surface of geopolitical maneuvering, daily life continued, fragile but persistent. The skies above the world still carried commercial aircraft. The oceans still held cargo vessels. Governments still issued official statements promising stability, but the underlying structure of global cooperation had eroded. Trust between nations had thinned to suspicion. Resource stockpiles dwindled. Nuclear arsenals expanded quietly, their presence justified as deterrent. When the Great War finally arrived in the year 2077, it did not shatter a peaceful world. It struck a planet already strained by decades of conflict, scarcity, and fragmentation. Alliances had fractured, regions had burned, economies had contracted. The nuclear exchange that followed was sudden and devastating, but it was the final rupture in a system that had been breaking for years. As the missiles rose and continents vanished beneath blinding light, the rest of the world was not an untouched observer. It was a participant in a long descent toward catastrophe. Every nation carried its own burdens, its own shortages, its own fears. And in the quiet moments before impact, across capitals and villages alike, there may have been a brief recognition, the realization that the crisis had never belonged to one country alone. It had been shared by all. As the global oil reserves dwindled and diplomatic channels narrowed, Europe sought stability through unity. The nations of the continent, long divided by history and rivalry, consolidated their political and military structures into what became known as the European Commonwealth. It was not formed from idealism, but from necessity. Shared energy shortages and economic strain left little room for independence. By pooling industry, coordinating defense, and centralizing resource distribution, European leaders hoped to shield their populations from the turbulence sweeping the world. At first, the Commonwealth brought a sense of order. Rail networks and power grids were managed collectively. Military forces trained under unified command structures. Borders softened internally. even as they hardened against the outside world. For a brief period, cooperation seemed capable of preserving stability in a time defined by scarcity. Yet beneath that coordinated surface lay mounting tension. The Middle East, still home to some of the last significant oil reserves, became the focal point of European attention. Negotiations for access to remaining fields faltered as regional governments resisted foreign influence. What began as diplomatic pressure soon escalated into open conflict. European forces deployed abroad, not as peacekeepers, but as protectors of energy supply. Skirmishes grew into sustained warfare across deserts and cities already strained by decades of overproduction. The conflict was brutal and protracted. Oil refineries became strategic targets, ports were blockaded, infrastructure that had once connected continents was systematically dismantled. The war did not remain conventional for long. In the desperation to secure resources, nuclear weapons were used in limited exchanges within the region. These detonations, though smaller in scale than the Great War to come, permanently altered parts of the Middle Eastern landscape. Fallout settled over once productive oil fields, rendering them useless. Cities that had survived centuries of change were reduced to irradiated ruins decades before the rest of the world would face similar devastation. Back in Europe, the strain of overseas war compounded domestic shortages. Fuel rationing intensified. Food supplies fluctuated. Industrial output slowed as energy grids struggled to maintain consistency. Civil unrest spread through major cities. Demonstrations, initially peaceful, turned volatile as public confidence in the Commonwealth faltered. Citizens who had accepted unity as protection began to question its cost. Economic systems grew increasingly centralized. Governments imposed stricter controls over production and distribution. Surveillance expanded to monitor dissent. Military presence became more visible within European streets. The promise of unity slowly transformed into a rigid structure designed to suppress instability rather than inspire cooperation. As the war in the Middle East dragged on, European nations faced the reality that even collective force could not restore the abundance of previous decades. Oil fields burned, refineries lay shattered, shipping lanes were disrupted by conflict and piracy. The Commonwealth, built to secure resources, found itself presiding over depletion instead. Political fractures emerged within the alliance. Member states argued over resource allocation. Wealthier regions resisted subsidizing those hit hardest by shortages. Internal disputes weakened coordinated defense. The very unity that had once offered reassurance now became a source of contention. Some nations considered withdrawal, while others tightened their grip in fear of collapse. The conflict in the Middle East eventually subsided, not through victory, but through exhaustion. The limited nuclear exchanges had devastated the region so thoroughly that further fighting offered little strategic value. What remained of the oil infrastructure was irradiated or destroyed. The war had consumed vast resources without solving the underlying scarcity. Europe returned from the conflict diminished. Its military was strained, its economy unstable, its population weary. The Commonwealth persisted, but its authority was fragile. Citizens adapted to a quieter, more restricted existence shaped by rationing and uncertainty. Blackouts became common, travel grew rare, industrial output never fully recovered. In this atmosphere of scarcity and mistrust, global diplomacy continued to erode. The dissolution of the United Nations removed any lingering framework for multilateral resolution. Without that forum, disputes between major powers escalated more rapidly. The Sino-American conflict intensified over remaining oil reserves in Alaska and the Pacific. Europe, weakened by its own wars, observed from a position of diminished influence. The resource wars had reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Regions once considered peripheral became central to survival. Military expansion became routine. Nuclear arsenals expanded quietly as deterrence replaced dialogue. Throughout this period, technological development accelerated in uneven ways. Energy research focused heavily on nuclear power as a substitute for fossil fuels. Civilian nuclear reactors proliferated across Europe, intended to stabilize grids and reduce dependence on imported oil. Robotics and automation were integrated into factories to compensate for labor shortages caused by unrest and military deployment. These advancements, while impressive, were pursued under pressure rather than optimism. Ordinary citizens experienced the resource wars not as grand strategy, but as daily limitation. Long queues formed for fuel and food. Curfews were enforced during periods of unrest. News broadcasts emphasized unity and sacrifice. Schools incorporated civil defense training into curricula. The culture of abundance that had defined much of the 20th century receded into memory, replaced by a quieter expectation of endurance. By the time the global nuclear exchange occurred in the year 2077, Europe had already endured decades of decline. Its infrastructure was weakened, its energy supplies precarious, its political alliances strained. When the missiles rose between the United States and China, European nations were not untouched observers. They were nuclear powers in their own right, equipped with arsenals developed during years of escalating tension. The precise sequence of strikes across Europe is not detailed in surviving records, but it is reasonable to conclude that major population centers and military installations were targeted. Cities that had survived the resource wars likely faced a second and more devastating wave of destruction. Power plants, already operating under stress, became liabilities. Fallout spread across regions still recovering from earlier conflict. The European Commonwealth, already fragile, would not have withstood such an assault intact. Its centralized structures depended on communication networks and stable governance. Nuclear detonations would have severed those connections instantly. Member states, isolated and irradiated, would have faced survival independently. In the long aftermath, the continent that had once sought unity to preserve order likely fragmented into localized enclaves. Agricultural zones may have endured where soil and climate permitted. Remote rural communities may have survived with fewer direct hits, but the industrial heart of Europe, dense with cities and infrastructure, would have suffered immensely. The resource wars had prepared Europe for hardship, but not for annihilation. They had trained populations to endure scarcity, to accept control, to sacrifice comfort, yet no amount of rationing could shield them from a global exchange of nuclear fire. And so, as the rest of the world burned, Europe did not enter the Great War as a stable power awaiting its turn. It entered already scarred by conflict, already diminished by decades of struggle over dwindling energy. The nuclear exchange was not the beginning of its collapse, but its final acceleration. Long before the Great War reduced continents to ash, parts of the Middle East had already experienced the future. The resource wars did not remain distant diplomatic standoffs. They reshaped the region into one of the earliest nuclear scar zones of the modern era. Oil, once drawn from beneath its deserts in vast and steady streams, had become the most contested substance on the planet. As reserves dwindled globally, the remaining fields in the region carried a weight far greater than their geography. The conflict began as competition over contracts and access. Foreign powers maneuvered for influence. Regional governments attempted to balance sovereignty with survival. But scarcity does not encourage patience. Military deployments followed political friction. Skirmishes along pipelines escalated into bombardments of refineries. Ports that once connected continents through trade were transformed into fortified checkpoints. When nuclear weapons were eventually used in limited exchanges during the resource wars, they were not unleashed in total global annihilation, but as instruments of strategic denial. Oil infrastructure became targets. Fields were scorched deliberately to prevent adversaries from exploiting them. The detonations were smaller than those of the Great War, yet devastating enough to alter landscapes permanently. Fallout drifted across deserts and into cities already strained by conventional warfare. Entire regions that had served as the economic engine of the world were rendered unusable decades before 2077. Wells collapsed, refineries were twisted into metallic ruins, radiation settled into soil and groundwater. Populations displaced by bombing and contamination sought refuge in overcrowded urban centers, only to find those cities increasingly unstable. Governments struggled to maintain authority amid the dual crises of war and environmental collapse. With oil production crippled, revenue streams dried up. Infrastructure repairs became impossible without foreign investment, and foreign powers were no longer interested in rebuilding what they could not control. As food imports dwindled and water supplies were disrupted, famine and disease followed. The cultural and political fabric of the region, long, complex, and diverse, faced unprecedented strain. Borders drawn in earlier centuries became lines of contention rather than governance. Militias and regional factions filled the void left by weakened states. Power fragmented. Control shifted rapidly between groups as resources grew scarce. For civilians, daily life contracted to survival. Markets that once bustled with trade grew quiet. Electricity flickered intermittently before failing entirely in many areas. Communication networks collapsed under bombardment and neglect. Families migrated when possible, seeking zones rumored to be less irradiated or more stable. Many found none. The limited nuclear exchanges of the resource wars did not attract the same global attention that the Great War later would, yet their consequences were profound. They demonstrated that nuclear weapons could be used not merely as deterrents, but as tactical instruments within resource conflict. This precedent lingered in the calculations of other nations. It lowered the threshold for imagining broader exchange. Environmentally, the damage compounded over time. Radiation did not dissipate quickly in arid climates. Dust storms carried contaminated particles across borders. Agricultural land became unreliable. Water purification systems, already stressed by conflict, struggled to remove radioactive elements. The region's long-standing dependence on imported food increased just as global trade networks were fracturing. As the years passed and the broader world edged closer to the brink, the Middle East remained caught in a cycle of reconstruction and renewed instability. International focus shifted toward the escalating conflict between the United States and China, leaving fewer resources available for humanitarian recovery. The region's earlier devastation became a grim warning, but not a deterrent. By the time the Great War erupted, parts of the Middle East had already adapted to a post-nuclear existence. Shelters built during the resource wars were reoccupied. Populations familiar with rationing and restricted mobility adjusted more quickly to renewed catastrophe. Yet the scale of the 2077 exchange dwarfed what had come before. Major urban centers across the region were likely targeted as strategic hubs or symbolic sites. Missile trajectories between global powers would not have spared the territory simply because it had already suffered. Air bases, ports, and communication nodes would have been considered viable targets. Additional detonations layered fresh fallout over landscapes still contaminated from earlier strikes. The compounded effect of sequential nuclear devastation likely left large swaths of the Middle East among the most inhospitable regions on the planet. Pre-existing infrastructure was insufficient to absorb further shock. Governance structures, already weakened, fragmented entirely. Regional coordination, necessary for large-scale recovery, became nearly impossible without functioning communication networks. Yet even in such conditions, survival persists. Small communities may have endured in remote or mountainous areas less directly targeted. Traditional knowledge of water sourcing and desert agriculture could have provided advantages where centralized systems failed. Nomadic or semi-nomadic groups accustomed to mobility may have adapted more fluidly to shifting contamination zones. Over the 2 centuries following the Great War, the Middle East likely remained isolated from other continents. Maritime trade routes were disrupted by global naval collapse. Aviation fuel was scarce and dangerous to transport. Without stable governments or industrial infrastructure, large-scale technological redevelopment would have been unlikely. The world beyond America often imagines itself through silence in Fallout's surviving records. That silence speaks most clearly in places that were already damaged before the final exchange. The Middle East, once the heart of global energy production, became instead one of the earliest examples of how scarcity can spiral into irreversible destruction. Its fate illustrates a broader pattern within the pre-war world. The Great War was not the sudden end of a peaceful planet. It was the culmination of regional collapses that had been unfolding for decades. The deserts that glowed faintly under radioactive skies had already lost their oil, their stability, and much of their population before the first intercontinental missiles crossed oceans. And so when the final detonations illuminated the horizon, the Middle East did not enter that moment as an untouched land awaiting catastrophe. It entered as a region already transformed by fire, already shaped by fallout, already navigating the long shadow of nuclear consequence. Across the Pacific, the People's Republic of China entered the final decades before the Great War under immense internal strain. Its rapid industrial expansion during the previous century had been fueled by fossil energy and centralized planning, but as global petroleum reserves dwindled, that expansion slowed. Factories required power, transportation networks demanded fuel, agricultural systems depended on mechanization and fertilizer production tied to energy supply. When shortages began to ripple through these systems, the effects were immediate and destabilizing. China's population remained vast, concentrated in dense urban corridors and coastal industrial zones. Feeding and maintaining such numbers required consistent access to energy and imported materials. As global trade fractured during the resource wars, imports became unreliable. Domestic oil production proved insufficient to meet national demand. The government, structured around centralized authority and ideological control, faced a crisis not only of resources but of legitimacy. Stability depended on the perception of progress. In response, Chinese leadership pursued aggressive strategies to secure remaining supplies. Resource diplomacy shifted into resource coercion. The competition with the United States intensified, particularly over the remaining petroleum reserves in Alaska. Anchorage became more than a remote territory. It became a symbol of survival. When Chinese forces invaded Alaska in the year 2066, it marked the transformation of energy competition into open war between the world's two most powerful nations. The Sino-American conflict unfolded across land, sea, and air. Chinese forces established footholds in Alaskan territory, attempting to secure access to oil infrastructure. The United States responded with heavy mobilization. Propaganda intensified on both sides. Each nation framed the conflict as defensive necessity rather than expansionist ambition. Beneath the rhetoric, however, lay a shared fear that without these resources, internal stability would collapse. Technological innovation accelerated under wartime pressure. China invested heavily in stealth technology, developing advanced infiltration systems designed to bypass American defenses. Stealth submarines patrolled the Pacific. Agents embedded themselves within American territory, gathering intelligence and preparing for sabotage. The development of stealth, armor, and camouflage systems reflected both technological sophistication and strategic desperation. Domestically, the Chinese government tightened control. Surveillance systems expanded. Industrial output was redirected toward military production. Civilian consumption declined further as rationing intensified. Public messaging emphasized unity and sacrifice. The conflict in Alaska was presented not as a distant campaign, but as a vital struggle for national survival. Despite the outward projection of strength, the prolonged war strained Chinese infrastructure. Transporting troops and equipment across the Pacific required immense logistical coordination. Naval confrontations, disrupted shipping routes. American counterattacks targeted supply chains. The longer the conflict endured, the more resources were consumed without decisive resolution. Within China's borders, economic stress compounded. Energy shortages worsened as global supplies tightened further. Urban populations faced increasing rationing. Rural areas struggled with mechanized agriculture dependent on dwindling fuel reserves. The state maintained order through strict regulation, but the underlying scarcity remained unresolved. As the global situation deteriorated, diplomatic channels between China and the United States grew increasingly hostile. The dissolution of broader international institutions removed neutral mediators. Each side interpreted the other's military movements as preparation for escalation. Nuclear arsenals, already extensive, were placed on heightened readiness. In the final years before 2077, China existed in a state of sustained mobilization. Factories produced weapons at relentless pace. Coastal defenses were reinforced. Airspace surveillance intensified. The population, accustomed to rationing and patriotic messaging, lived under the constant awareness of conflict. Yet, even amid tension, daily life persisted. Schools operated, markets opened under controlled conditions. Families adapted to constrained circumstances, finding routine within limitation. The government's strategic posture increasingly relied on the belief that deterrence would prevent total nuclear exchange. The memory of limited nuclear use during the resource wars served as both warning and precedent. Tactical nuclear deployment had been possible without triggering immediate global annihilation. Some within leadership may have believed that similar limited exchanges could remain contained. However, as hostilities with the United States escalated, the margin for miscalculation narrowed. Military engagements in Alaska intensified. Technological breakthroughs on both sides altered the balance of power repeatedly. The deployment of advanced American power armor units during the liberation of Anchorage demonstrated the United States' capacity to shift battlefield dynamics. For China, the loss of momentum in Alaska represented not only military defeat, but strategic vulnerability. The war did not remain isolated to one region. Cyber operations, espionage, and covert sabotage extended the conflict globally. Chinese operatives embedded in foreign territories prepared contingency plans. Submarines equipped with nuclear payloads positioned themselves in distant waters. Each nation sought advantage while preparing for the possibility of ultimate escalation. By the autumn of 2077, the world stood on the edge of irreversible decision. Within China, military command structures maintained readiness at the highest levels. Civil defense systems existed, but unlike the extensive vault networks constructed in the United States, there is little evidence of comparable large-scale civilian shelter programs across Chinese territory. The focus had remained primarily on military capacity and strategic deterrence. When the Great War finally ignited, the precise sequence of events remains obscured by the collapse of communication networks. Whether China launched first or responded to American action is debated within surviving accounts. What is clear is that China possessed a significant nuclear arsenal and the capability to deliver it across continents. American cities were struck, military installations were targeted. The exchange was rapid and catastrophic. It is equally clear that China itself would have faced overwhelming retaliation. American nuclear forces, both land-based and submarine deployed, would have targeted major Chinese population centers, industrial zones, and military command facilities. Cities dense with civilians and infrastructure would have been engulfed in light and shockwaves within minutes. In the silence that followed, China, like the United States, would have been transformed. Industrial corridors reduced to rubble, power grids shattered, government command structures severed, radiation drifting across once fertile plains. The centralized authority that had governed the nation for decades would have struggled to reassert control in a landscape fragmented by destruction. Before the Great War, China was not merely an adversary in a distant conflict. It was a nation navigating scarcity, technological innovation, and geopolitical rivalry under immense pressure. Its decisions were shaped by fear of decline as much as by ambition. In the final moments before nuclear exchange, it stood as one of the two pillars upon which global stability precariously rested. When that stability collapsed, the fall was not unilateral. The Pacific did not separate safety from devastation. It connected two superpowers bound together by rivalry and fear, and when the missiles rose, both shores were consumed by the same blinding horizon. When the nuclear exchange of 2077 ended, communication between continents ceased almost instantly. Whatever command structures survived in the first moments of detonation would have been blinded by electromagnetic pulses and the destruction of satellites. China, already mobilized for prolonged war, would have felt the full force of retaliation within minutes. Major industrial cities along the eastern seaboard, dense with factories and population, were almost certainly primary targets. Ports, naval bases, and missile silos would have been struck with precision. The centralized authority that had governed from Beijing would have faced fragmentation under overwhelming devastation, unlike the United States, which had invested heavily in an extensive network of underground vaults designed to preserve segments of its population. There is little evidence of a comparable nationwide civilian shelter system across China. The Chinese government prioritized military readiness and strategic deterrence. While military bunkers and hardened command centers undoubtedly existed, large-scale protection for civilians appears absent from surviving references. This difference alone would have shaped the immediate aftermath. In the hours following impact, urban centers would have descended into silence, broken only by secondary explosions and structural collapse. Power grids failed. Transportation networks became impassable. Radiation spread through wind currents across provinces already strained by decades of industrial stress. The sheer population density of coastal China meant that the human toll would have been immense. Yet, Fallout Canon provides brief, fragmented glimpses that suggest China did not simply vanish into total extinction. Along the American coastline, remnants of Chinese military presence survived long after the war. The crew of a stealth submarine, isolated beneath the Pacific, remained operational for generations. Their survival indicates that at least some elements of the Chinese military infrastructure were designed for extended autonomy. Submarines, equipped with self-sustaining systems and nuclear propulsion, could endure long after surface command structures were destroyed. The existence of Chinese operatives and infiltrators within American territory prior to the war further implies that contingency planning extended beyond immediate battlefield engagement. Espionage networks may have been instructed to operate independently should central authority collapse. In the chaos following global annihilation, such networks might have persisted without direct guidance, adapting to new realities or dissolving entirely. Within China itself, survival would have depended heavily on geography. Inland provinces, particularly mountainous or rural regions less central to industrial production, may have avoided the heaviest targeting. Agricultural communities far from missile silos and major cities could have endured initial detonations with lower casualty rates. However, survival in the long term required more than distance from blast zones. Nuclear winter, global atmospheric contamination, and the collapse of trade would have affected even remote areas. The 2 centuries that followed remain largely silent in canon regarding Chinese reconstruction. No organized Chinese fleets appear on American shores. No confirmed diplomatic contact between surviving Chinese states and the post-war United States is documented. This absence suggests prolonged isolation, whether due to infrastructural collapse, lack of seafaring capability, or continued internal fragmentation. It is possible that the centralized communist government fractured into regional authorities in the immediate aftermath. Provincial military commanders, cut off from national leadership, may have asserted control over localized territories. China's pre-war emphasis on centralized planning would have made sudden decentralization chaotic. Competing factions could have emerged, each attempting to claim legitimacy amid scarcity and radiation. The nation's technological sophistication prior to the war may have offered advantages in certain sectors. Nuclear energy research was advanced, industrial automation and robotics were widespread. Military bunkers likely contained hardened communication equipment. However, technology alone cannot guarantee coordination without stable governance. Power plants require maintenance. Supply chains require transport. Even advanced machinery eventually fails without infrastructure. Environmental conditions would have compounded the challenge. Fallout patterns across East Asia are unknown, but prevailing wind currents could have carried contamination deep inland. Agricultural collapse would have followed global cooling and atmospheric particulate accumulation. Urban centers, stripped of power and sanitation, would have faced disease outbreaks in the months after detonation. Yet survival stories in fallout often emerge from unlikely places. The persistence of a Chinese submarine crew for more than 2 centuries demonstrates resilience embedded within pre-war design. If one vessel could endure, others may have as well. Remote naval bases or underground facilities might have sheltered personnel long enough to establish isolated communities. Over generations, these enclaves could have evolved into self-contained societies, cut off from the larger world. The question of whether a unified Chinese state ever re-emerged remains unanswered within canon. The silence may imply continued fragmentation. Without access to transoceanic fleets or large-scale aviation fuel production, long-distance travel would have been nearly impossible. Rebuilding such capabilities requires industrial networks unlikely to survive concentrated nuclear targeting. It is also possible that the devastation was so complete across major urban corridors that China's ability to project power beyond its borders was permanently diminished. In contrast to the United States, where organizations like the New California Republic eventually consolidated territory and resources over 2 centuries, no parallel Chinese superstate has appeared in surviving records. This suggests either continued internal instability or geographical isolation so profound that contact simply never resumed. Cultural memory within surviving Chinese communities would have been shaped by both the resource wars and the final exchange. Generations raised in scarcity before the war may have adapted more quickly to post-nuclear existence. Agricultural techniques, rationing systems, and centralized discipline could have aided initial survival, yet the psychological toll of annihilation would have lingered, as it did across the globe. The absence of Chinese presence in post-war American narratives reinforces a broader theme within Fallout. The Great War severed the world not only through destruction, but through isolation. Oceans became barriers once more. Without functioning fleets or global trade networks, continents drifted into silence. China, once locked in rivalry with the United States, vanished from its horizon. And so what happened to China after 2077 remains partly concealed by distance and time. It was struck with overwhelming force. Its cities likely burned, its government fragmented, yet fragments of its people endured, as evidenced by the few surviving remnants encountered abroad, somewhere across the Pacific. Beyond irradiated waters and silent coasts, the echoes of that nation's struggle continued in forms unseen. The world did not end in a single instant. It fractured into isolated remnants, each adapting alone. China's fate, like that of many regions beyond America, lies not in confirmed extinction, but in enduring absence. To the north of Europe and west of China lay another vast power whose fate after the Great War remains largely unspoken. The Soviet Union continued to exist within the timeline of Fallout. though its role in the final years before 2077 appears muted compared to the escalating rivalry between the United States and China. Its presence, however, cannot be dismissed. It was a nuclear state with immense territory, industrial capacity, and strategic weight. In the decades preceding the war, the Soviet Union would have faced many of the same pressures shaping the rest of the world. Energy scarcity did not respect ideology. Oil depletion affected both capitalist and communist systems alike. Industrial economies across Eurasia depended on fossil fuels for transport, electricity, and military readiness. As global reserves diminished and trade fractured, the Soviet Union would have confronted difficult internal adjustment. Its vast landmass offered certain advantages. Unlike densely populated Western Europe, much of Soviet territory stretched across sparsely inhabited plains and forests. Remote regions, particularly in Siberia, were less likely to serve as immediate strategic targets compared to industrial hubs in Moscow, Leningrad, or other major cities. This geographical breadth may have provided limited buffers against complete annihilation. Politically, the Soviet Union had long maintained a centralized governance structure capable of strict internal control. Surveillance, military discipline, and planned resource allocation were embedded within its system. Such structures might have provided short-term resilience during escalating global instability. Rationing, industrial redirection, and population control were mechanisms already familiar to its leadership. Yet even a vast territory cannot escape nuclear calculus. As tensions between the United States and China intensified, the Soviet Union would have navigated a precarious diplomatic path. Whether it aligned more closely with one superpower or attempted neutrality is unclear within surviving records. What is certain is that it possessed its own nuclear arsenal, developed during earlier decades of global rivalry. In a full-scale exchange, nuclear targeting strategies rarely spare other nuclear-capable states. Major Soviet cities and missile sites would have represented potential threats within the broader matrix of global destruction. Intercontinental ballistic missile silos scattered across its territory, submarine bases along Arctic waters, and airfields housing strategic bombers would have been considered viable targets. Even if the initial exchange centered on Sino-American hostility, the inclusion of other nuclear powers in retaliatory logic seems likely. The immediate aftermath within Soviet territory would have mirrored patterns seen elsewhere. Urban centers reduced to rubble, communications severed, power grids disabled, industrial complexes, already strained by resource shortages, rendered inoperable. The centralized command hierarchy, dependent on layered communication systems, would have struggled to maintain coherence under widespread electromagnetic pulse disruption and physical devastation. However, the Soviet Union's extensive experience with hardened bunkers and underground facilities may have allowed segments of its military and political leadership to survive initial strikes. During earlier eras of tension, underground command centers had been constructed to ensure continuity of governance. These facilities, if operational at the time of detonation, could have sheltered personnel long enough to attempt coordination. Survival in such bunkers, however, does not equate to restoration of national unity. Emerging into a landscape scarred by radiation and infrastructure collapse would have presented overwhelming challenges. The vast distances that once defined the Soviet Union's strength could have become barriers in a world without functioning transport networks. Rail systems, reliant on electricity or fuel, would have faltered. Highways clogged with debris and fallout would have been impassable. In rural and remote regions, particularly deep within Siberia, communities less directly targeted might have endured with fewer immediate casualties. Agricultural practices adapted to harsh climates could have provided limited sustenance. Forested zones and river systems might have supported small enclaves. Isolation, once considered a disadvantage, may have offered protection from concentrated strikes. Over 2 centuries, such enclaves could have evolved independently. Without reliable communication across thousands of miles, regional identities may have superseded national cohesion. Former provinces might have functioned as autonomous territories, governed by local military remnants or community leaders. The concept of a unified Soviet state may have gradually dissolved into memory. Canon provides little direct evidence of post-war Soviet contact with North America. No fleets bearing its insignia appear on American shores. No confirmed transmissions are recorded across the Pacific or Arctic. This silence suggests either profound devastation, continued isolation, or both. The Arctic Ocean, though navigable in pre-war times, would have been fraught with radioactive contamination and the collapse of naval logistics. Technologically, the Soviet Union possessed advanced military hardware and nuclear engineering expertise. Some facilities may have continued operating autonomously for years after the war, sustained by reactor power and stockpiled provisions. Yet even the most robust installations eventually require external support. Without functioning supply chains, replacement parts, or fresh personnel, systems degrade. Culturally, survivors within former Soviet territories would have inherited a narrative shaped by endurance. Generations accustomed to centralized authority and hardship may have adapted to post-nuclear life with grim resolve. Oral histories of the Great War would have merged with earlier memories of global rivalry, forming a distinct regional mythology. It is possible that, somewhere within the immense stretches of Eurasia, a successor state arose quietly, consolidating limited territory and resources. It is equally possible that fragmentation prevented any large-scale reconstitution of power. The absence of canonical confirmation leaves room only for measured inference. What can be said with confidence is that the Soviet Union did not exist outside the chain of consequence. It was a nuclear power in a world defined by escalating tension. When that tension resolved into annihilation, it would have shared in the devastation. Its cities, like those of other superpowers, would have felt the same blinding flash. Beyond the horizon of the American wasteland, across Arctic winds and endless forests, the remnants of that once vast state likely endured in silence, not erased entirely, but transformed beyond recognition. The world that followed did not revolve around old alliances. It fractured into isolated stories, each continent carrying its own memory of fire. Beyond the Atlantic, the United Kingdom and the nations of Western Europe entered the final years before the Great War, already diminished by decades of scarcity and conflict. The European Commonwealth, formed in response to energy collapse, had promised coordination and shared resilience. Yet unity forged under pressure rarely remains unstrained. By the time global tensions reached their breaking point, Western Europe stood fragile, its infrastructure stressed and its populations accustomed to rationing. The United Kingdom, an island nation long sustained by maritime trade, felt the contraction of global shipping networks acutely. As oil shortages deepened, international commerce slowed. Imports of fuel and food became uncertain. Ports that once thrived on constant traffic grew quieter. The Royal Navy, like other fleets, required energy and maintenance that became increasingly difficult to guarantee. Maritime strength, once the foundation of British security, was constrained by the same shortages affecting the rest of the world. Within its cities, life narrowed in scope. London, dense and historic, relied on complex power grids and transport systems vulnerable to disruption. Rail lines required electricity. Underground networks required maintenance. When energy became precious, these systems operated intermittently. Citizens adapted to blackouts and restricted travel. Public messaging emphasized perseverance and unity, echoing earlier eras of wartime resilience. On the European mainland, Western nations such as France and Germany faced similar pressures. Industrial economies built on steady imports and exports struggled as trade routes faltered. The scars of the resource wars lingered. Economic contraction fueled political tension. Governments leaned into centralized authority to maintain order. Surveillance expanded quietly. Military readiness increased as global rivalries intensified. Unlike the United States, Western Europe did not invest in a vast network of experimental civilian shelters comparable to the American Vault system. Civil defense programs existed, but their scale and ambition were limited. Urban density made comprehensive protection nearly impossible. Large populations clustered within historic cities would have been particularly vulnerable to nuclear targeting. Strategically, Western Europe occupied a central position between major powers. Military bases, airfields, and missile installations dotted the landscape. Nuclear arsenals were present across several states. In a full-scale exchange, these assets would have been high-priority targets. Even if initial strikes centered on the United States and China, retaliatory calculations would have incorporated other nuclear-capable nations. When the Great War erupted in 2077, the Atlantic did not serve as a shield. Intercontinental ballistic missiles crossed oceans within minutes. Major capitals such as London and Paris would have represented symbolic and strategic objectives. Military installations along coastlines and within Central Europe would have been struck to eliminate potential response capacity. The immediate consequences within Western Europe likely mirrored those seen elsewhere. Dense urban centers magnified the impact of detonations. Infrastructure collapsed rapidly. Fires consumed historic districts. Electromagnetic pulses disabled communication networks. Emergency response systems, already strained by decades of austerity, were overwhelmed within moments. Radiation drifted across borders without regard for national identity. Fallout clouds moved with prevailing winds, settling over rural farmland and urban ruins alike. Agricultural production, critical for survival, suffered severe contamination. Livestock perished, crops failed. The initial blasts were only the beginning of a prolonged environmental crisis. Yet even amid devastation, geography offered limited pockets of possibility. Mountainous zones in the Alps could have shielded smaller communities from the worst shockwaves. Islands off the western coast of Britain or along the French shoreline might have experienced reduced fallout depending on wind patterns. Survival in such areas would have depended on local food production and freshwater access. Over 2 centuries, isolated enclaves in Western Europe may have endured, developing independently of any centralized authority. Without functioning maritime fleets or transoceanic communication, contact with North America would have been unlikely. The collapse of global trade meant that rebuilding naval power required resources difficult to obtain. Shipyards need steel, energy, and skilled labor. All were scarce. Culturally, survivors would have inherited long histories layered with new catastrophe. Memories of world wars, economic depression, and civil unrest would blend with the singular trauma of nuclear exchange. Oral traditions may have preserved fragments of pre-war identity, though stripped of the global connectivity that once defined European life. In contrast to the rise of organizations such as the New California Republic in the American West, no canon source confirms the emergence of a comparable Western European federation in the centuries after the war. This absence may reflect the scale of destruction in densely populated areas. It may also reflect thematic isolation within the narrative focus of Fallout, which centers primarily on American Reconstruction. Still, the silence does not equate to emptiness. Somewhere within the ruins of cathedrals and collapsed transit systems, communities may have rebuilt in smaller forms. Fortified towns within ancient stone walls could have found new purpose. Coastal villages may have turned inward, relying on fishing in waters slowly recovering from contamination. The United Kingdom and Western Europe did not vanish from existence. They endured what the rest of the world endured: fire, fallout, and isolation. Their pre-war fragility made the shock more devastating, but not uniquely so. The Great War did not discriminate between old empires and rising powers. It reduced them alike to fractured landscapes. And across the Atlantic, long after the bombs fell, no fleets bearing European flags appeared on American shores, whether because they could not or chose not to. The oceans remained empty of their return. In that absence lies the quiet suggestion that Western Europe, like much of the world, turned inward to survive, its voice fading into the same distant silence that now stretches beyond every horizon. At the heart of the European continent lay nations whose histories were defined by industry, dense cities, and intricate networks of rail and river trade. France and the states of Central Europe entered the final decades before the Great War, already burdened by the consequences of energy collapse and continental conflict. Their landscapes were marked not only by medieval cathedrals and modern skylines, but by factories, refineries, and power plants that demanded constant fuel. During the era of the European Commonwealth, Central Europe became a corridor of coordination and strain. Shared military command and centralized resource allocation passed through cities like Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. Rail lines carried troops and supplies toward distant fronts during the resource wars. Industrial centers labored under intensified production quotas, even as energy shortages deepened. The promise of continental unity rested heavily upon these regions. France, positioned between Atlantic trade routes and continental industry, faced its own pressures. Its agricultural zones were vital for sustaining populations already rationed. Nuclear energy programs expanded in response to fossil fuel scarcity, adding reactors to landscapes already dotted with industrial infrastructure. These reactors provided temporary stability, but they also introduced vulnerability. In the event of nuclear attack or prolonged grid failure, containment systems would struggle without maintenance. As the global situation deteriorated, Central Europe's strategic significance grew. Airfields, missile installations, and command centers were distributed across the region. Its central location made it a potential launch platform and target alike. Nuclear-capable states, situated within or near its borders, ensured that any large-scale exchange would inevitably involve its territory. By the autumn of 2077, the continent was not an isolated observer of escalating tension between the United States and China. Military readiness had increased across Europe. Early warning systems monitored global activity. Civil defense drills, though less extensive than American Vault programs, reminded citizens of the possibility of catastrophe, yet the scale of what followed exceeded preparation. When the Great War erupted, France and Central Europe likely faced rapid and concentrated strikes. Major urban centers such as Paris and Berlin represented both symbolic and logistical targets. Missile silos, air bases, and industrial complexes were likely prioritized. The dense urban fabric of these cities amplified the impact. Shockwaves traveled through tightly packed neighborhoods. Fires spread quickly across historic districts and modern high-rises alike. Rivers that once carried commerce carried debris and contamination. The Rhine, the Seine, and the Danube would have become channels for radioactive runoff. Bridges collapsed, ports were rendered inoperable. The interwoven rail networks that had once unified the continent were severed within moments. Communication lines, already strained by years of austerity, fell silent under electromagnetic pulse disruption. Agricultural regions, particularly in France's countryside and across parts of Germany and Poland, faced a different but equally severe challenge. Fallout drifting from targeted urban centers settled over farmland. Soil contamination reduced crop yields. Livestock exposed to radiation perished or became unsafe for consumption. Food scarcity, already familiar from pre-war rationing, deepened into famine. Yet geography offers uneven patterns of destruction. Remote alpine communities in Austria or Switzerland may have experienced reduced blast damage, shielded partially by mountainous terrain. Rural areas distant from strategic targets could have endured initial detonations with lower casualty rates. Survival in these zones would have depended on self-sufficiency and access to uncontaminated water. Switzerland, known historically for neutrality and fortified infrastructure, may have possessed hardened bunkers capable of sheltering portions of its population. If such facilities functioned during the exchange, small enclaves could have survived beneath mountains while surface devastation unfolded. However, even well-prepared shelters eventually face resource limits. Long-term survival requires arable land and functioning ecosystems. Over the centuries that followed, Central Europe likely fragmented into isolated territories. Without functioning continental governance or reliable transport networks, coordination across borders would have been rare. Former national identities may have persisted in memory, but practical authority would have resided in localized communities or remnants of military structures. Industrial ruins across the continent would have stood as monuments to former capacity. Reactor sites, if damaged or neglected, could have become long-term sources of contamination. Urban centers reduced to skeletal frameworks might have remained too irradiated for resettlement for decades or longer. In such environments, survivors would have gravitated towards smaller towns and rural landscapes. Unlike the western coast of the United States, where the new California Republic eventually consolidated territory and established trade routes, no canon record confirms the rise of a unified Central European power in the post-war centuries. The absence of contact with North America reinforces the likelihood of prolonged isolation. Transatlantic travel, dependent on functional fleets and fuel production, would have been exceedingly difficult. Cultural memory in these regions would have carried deep historical layers. The trauma of earlier world wars, economic collapse, and political upheaval would merge with the singular devastation of nuclear exchange. Stories of cities lost in light and sound would join centuries-old chronicles of conflict. Yet daily survival would have shaped identity more than memory. Communities would have measured time by harvest cycles and seasonal radiation patterns rather than by former political eras. In France and Central Europe, the Great War likely erased not only infrastructure but also the intricate web of interdependence that once defined the continent. The rail lines that stitched nations together became twisted remnants. The open borders of the Commonwealth dissolved into localized survival zones. Cathedrals and palaces, symbols of enduring culture, stood beside charred factories and silent reactors. Across the Atlantic, generations later, no envoys arrived bearing European insignia. The world beyond America remained quiet, whether from devastation, isolation, or deliberate inward focus. France and the nations of Central Europe did not re-enter the global stage as they once had. They endured, transformed into landscapes of memory and adaptation, shaped by the same fire that touched every shore. Across the immense stretch of northern Eurasia lay a land defined by distance. Forests, tundra, rivers, and industrial cities spread across thousands of miles, connecting Europe to the Pacific. In the years before the Great War, Russia stood as the geographic heart of the former Soviet Union, vast and formidable. Its cities were centers of military production and heavy industry. Its plains held missile silos and early warning stations. Its Arctic coastlines housed submarine fleets capable of crossing beneath polar ice. Energy scarcity did not bypass Russia, yet its territory contained reserves that offered limited insulation from immediate collapse. Oil and natural gas fields within Siberia provided domestic supply longer than in many regions. Still, global shortages and trade contraction altered internal stability. Industrial output was redirected increasingly toward military preparedness. Civilian life adapted to controlled consumption and centralized oversight. Strategically, Russia's importance was undeniable. Intercontinental ballistic missile sites scattered across its territory formed part of the global nuclear balance. Air bases and radar installations monitored airspace stretching over Europe and Asia. In any scenario of full-scale nuclear exchange, such assets would have been prime targets. When the Great War ignited, Russia's vastness may have offered no shield against precision. Major cities, such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, would have represented symbolic and strategic objectives. Missile silos, submarine pens, and command centers likely drew concentrated strikes. The density of targets within certain industrial corridors ensured devastating impact in those regions. Yet geography again introduces uneven consequence. Large swaths of Siberia consist of sparsely populated terrain. Towns separated by hundreds of miles of forest or tundra may have avoided direct blast effect. If targeting focused on military and industrial hubs, remote villages could have survived the initial detonations with lower immediate casualties. The Arctic region held particular strategic significance. Submarine fleets operating beneath polar ice could launch or receive strikes while insulated from some surface detection. In the aftermath of nuclear exchange, these submarines may have remained operational for extended periods, sustained by nuclear propulsion. Whether they returned to shattered ports or continued autonomous patrols remains unknown. If ports were destroyed or irradiated, crews might have faced impossible choices regarding resupply and habitation. Radiation patterns across Russia would have varied widely. Prevailing winds could have carried fallout eastward or westward depending on detonation site. Rivers such as the Volga and the Ob might have transported contamination across broad territories. Agricultural zones in the south and west, critical for food production, would have been vulnerable to both blast and fallout. In the months following the exchange, centralized governance would have struggled to reassert control across such distances. Communication networks, severed by electromagnetic pulse and physical destruction, would have left regional commanders isolated. Military districts might have operated independently, prioritizing local survival over national coordination. The scale that once defined Russia's strength could have complicated unified recovery. Industrial facilities, especially those dependent on complex supply chains, would have faced gradual failure. Reactors without maintenance risked meltdown. Factories without replacement parts fell silent. Rail systems, essential for linking vast territories, became unusable without electricity or fuel. The interconnected nature of modern infrastructure revealed its fragility under sustained disruption. Over time, isolated enclaves may have formed around defensible terrain. Mountainous regions in the Caucasus, remote Siberian settlements, or communities along freshwater lakes could have supported small populations. Harsh climates, while challenging, might have limited mutation and competition for resources compared to more temperate and densely irradiated zones. The absence of confirmed post-war Russian contact with North America suggests prolonged inward focus or inability to project power. Re-establishing naval fleets capable of crossing oceans requires functioning shipyards, refined fuel, and coordinated command. After widespread devastation, such capabilities would have been difficult to restore quickly. Culturally, survivors would have inherited a narrative of endurance, layered upon centuries of hardship. Historical memory of invasion, revolution, and industrial mobilization may have framed the Great War as another chapter in a long continuum of survival. Oral traditions could have preserved fragments of pre-war identity, though shaped by the immediate demands of post-nuclear existence. It is possible that a successor state, smaller and regionally confined, emerged from the remnants of former federal structures. It is equally plausible that fragmentation persisted, with territories governed by localized authorities rather than a reconstituted central government. Canon remains silent on the outcome, offering only the certainty that Russia, like other nuclear powers, did not escape the fire. Across the frozen plains and dense forests, the scars of detonation would have lingered. Concrete bunkers half buried in snow, abandoned radar towers silhouetted against pale skies, cities reduced to skeletal outlines, and beyond them, stretches of wilderness slowly reclaiming what industry once claimed. The world beyond America holds many such silences. Russia's fate rests within that quiet distance. not erased entirely, but transformed beyond the reach of transoceanic memory. Its vastness, once a measure of strength, became a landscape of isolated endurance beneath a sky that had burned for all nations alike. Before the world ended in fire, Canada had already been drawn directly into the orbit of American desperation. As petroleum reserves dwindled and the Sino-American conflict intensified, the United States moved to secure the supply lines running through its northern neighbor. What began as increased military presence evolved into full annexation. Canadian sovereignty dissolved under pressure framed as necessity. The annexation was not quiet. Civil unrest spread across Canadian cities. Protests were met with military enforcement. Martial law replaced civilian governance in many regions. Infrastructure, particularly pipelines and transport corridors linking Alaska to the continental United States, became heavily guarded arteries of survival. Canadian citizens found themselves living beneath occupation, their territory transformed into a strategic extension of American defense. By the time the Great War erupted in 2077, Canada was no longer merely an adjacent nation. It was integrated into the American military framework. Missile defense installations, radar stations, and supply depots dotted its vast landscape. Its northern geography, stretching toward the Arctic, made it a crucial component of continental early warning systems. This integration meant that Canada would not have been spared in a full-scale nuclear exchange. Strategic planners targeting the United States would have identified Canadian bases and infrastructure as legitimate objectives. Airfields, missile sites, and command centers across provinces such as Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia would have represented viable targets. Major Canadian cities, including Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, were densely populated urban centers, intertwined economically and militarily with American systems. Whether targeted directly or struck due to proximity to military installations, these cities likely suffered devastating consequences. Shockwaves would have moved through metropolitan corridors. Fires would have consumed neighborhoods already tense from years of occupation. Yet Canada's geography differs significantly from that of many other nations. Vast stretches of forest, tundra, and sparsely inhabited terrain separate urban hubs. Northern territories in particular are characterized by low population density and extreme climate. These factors may have limited the number of direct strikes required to neutralize strategic assets. Remote communities far from military sites could have avoided immediate destruction. The Arctic region, including areas of Yukon and the Northwest Territories, held early warning stations and radar installations. These facilities would have been prime targets. However, settlements beyond such installations might have survived initial detonations. Harsh climates that once seemed inhospitable may have provided partial insulation from the densest fallout patterns, depending on prevailing winds. In the aftermath, Canada would have faced the same systemic collapse seen elsewhere. Power grids failed, transportation networks were severed, rail lines linking east and west became unusable. Ports along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts were rendered inoperable. The integration of Canadian infrastructure with American systems meant that, when those systems fell, Canada's did as well. Agricultural regions across the prairies may have experienced mixed outcomes. While less densely targeted than major cities, they remained vulnerable to fallout drifting from strikes to the south. Crop failure and livestock contamination would have compounded food scarcity. Winters, already severe, would have become harsher under the conditions of nuclear winter and disrupted supply chains. Over the 2 centuries following the war, survivors in Canadian territories may have adapted in ways distinct from their southern counterparts. Remote logging communities, fishing villages along isolated coasts, and indigenous settlements with long-standing knowledge of local environments could have formed the nucleus of post-war enclaves. Self-sufficiency in harsh climates requires resilience and adaptability traits, likely invaluable in the aftermath. References within surviving American records hint at settlements such as Ronto, suggesting that some form of organized community arose within former Canadian territory. Whether Ronto represented a city rebuilt from Toronto's ruins or a new settlement bearing its name, its existence implies survival and eventual reorganization. Trade or migration between regions of the former United States and Canada may have resumed in limited forms over time. However, the annexation prior to the Great War blurred the distinction between American and Canadian post-war identities. Regions once separated by border became part of a shared continental wasteland. The political narrative of Canada as an independent nation may have faded over generations, replaced by localized identities tied to geography rather than pre-war statehood. The Arctic and subarctic climates could have influenced mutation patterns differently than in warmer regions. Lower temperatures and seasonal darkness may have limited certain ecological transformations while intensifying others. Wildlife adapted to extreme conditions might have remained dominant in areas where human population declined sharply. Maritime travel between Canadian coasts and other continents would have faced the same challenges as elsewhere. Fuel scarcity, damaged shipyards, and radioactive waters. Without robust naval reconstruction, Canada's post-war communities would have remained largely continental in focus, interacting primarily with neighboring American territories rather than distant nations. The annexation that preceded the Great War ensured that Canada's fate was inseparable from that of the United States. When the missiles rose, they did not pause at former borders. The same fire that consumed American cities swept across Canadian skies. Yet within its immense forests and frozen landscapes, fragments of survival likely endured. 2 centuries later, no unified Canadian nation appears to have re-emerged as a global actor. Instead, its territory became part of the broader North American wasteland, vast, quiet, and marked by remnants of occupation and war. The forests still stand in places, the rivers still flow, and beneath northern lights that glow across darkened skies, communities may persist, shaped by memory of annexation and the shared cataclysm that followed. South of the former United States, beyond the deserts of Arizona and the coasts of Texas, lay a region deeply intertwined with American industry long before the Great War began. Mexico and the nations of Central America were not distant observers of global tension. Their oil fields, trade routes, and labor networks had been woven into the economic fabric of North America for decades. As energy scarcity intensified, this interdependence grew heavier and more strained. Mexico in particular possessed valuable petroleum reserves. As American domestic supplies diminished, reliance on neighboring sources increased. Economic pressure accompanied military interest. Though not formally annexed in the manner of Canada, Mexico's sovereignty existed under the shadow of American necessity. Industrial extraction expanded even as domestic infrastructure struggled to meet internal needs. The resource wars reshaped the region indirectly at first. As global trade contracted, export markets narrowed. Agricultural economies reliant on stable fuel prices faced disruption. Political instability simmered in areas already managing economic inequality. The pressure of serving as a resource corridor for a superpower at war added further strain. By the time the Sino-American conflict escalated into full confrontation, northern Mexico had become strategically significant. Supply lines transporting materials and fuel through border regions required protection. Military installations and logistical hubs likely expanded along critical corridors. The border between the United States and Mexico blurred into a zone of militarized infrastructure. When the Great War erupted in 2077, missile trajectories aimed at the United States would not have respected geographic boundaries. Border cities such as Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and others near American strategic sites may have suffered collateral damage. Major Mexican urban centers, including Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, represented densely populated areas that could have been targeted directly if perceived as hosting military or industrial assets connected to American operations. The scale of destruction across Mexico would have varied by region. Northern territories closely integrated with American defense networks faced greater likelihood of direct impact. Central and southern regions, though not immune to fallout, may have experienced fewer immediate detonations. Yet even areas untouched by blast effects would have endured secondary consequences. Radiation drifting south from strikes across the American Southwest would have contaminated farmland and water sources. Prevailing winds could have carried particulate matter deep into Mexican territory. Agricultural systems, particularly in fertile valleys, would have suffered. Livestock contamination and crop failure would have compounded existing food insecurity. Central America, less industrialized and less directly tied to nuclear arsenals, may have avoided concentrated targeting. Nations such as Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica possessed limited strategic military assets on the global stage. However, their economies were deeply connected to international trade. The collapse of global shipping networks and energy distribution would have struck them with equal force. Ports along both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific coast fell silent as maritime traffic ceased. Tourism, agriculture, and export industries collapsed in tandem. Without access to imported fuel, mechanized farming slowed. Electrical grids faltered without replacement parts and consistent energy supply. In rural regions, subsistence agriculture may have provided a degree of resilience. Communities accustomed to local production and decentralized systems could have adapted more fluidly than highly urbanized centers. Mountainous terrain across southern Mexico and Central America may have shielded some areas from the worst blast effects, though not from long-term climate disruption. The onset of nuclear winter would have altered rainfall patterns and reduced growing seasons across the region. Even tropical climates would not have escaped atmospheric consequences. Cooler temperatures and diminished sunlight threatened harvest cycles. River systems, vital for irrigation and drinking water, risked contamination from fallout drifting from northern detonations. Over the 2 centuries that followed, the absence of large-scale naval reconstruction likely limited transoceanic contact. The Caribbean and Gulf waters, once filled with trade vessels, became unpredictable and potentially contaminated. Without industrial capacity to rebuild fleets, regional isolation deepened. Canon references to territories south of the United States are sparse, yet occasional hints suggest survival rather than extinction. Travelers speak of lands beyond the border. Trade routes between southwestern American settlements and southern territories imply at least limited interaction over time. Such references indicate that some form of organized communities persisted. Mexico's diverse geography may have fostered varied outcomes. Arid northern deserts, mountainous highlands, and fertile southern plains would each respond differently to nuclear fallout. In some regions, natural barriers could have slowed the spread of contamination. In others, densely populated valleys may have magnified its impact. Culturally, survivors would have drawn upon long-standing traditions of community resilience. Oral histories of conquest, revolution, and adaptation would have absorbed the memory of nuclear catastrophe into broader narratives of endurance. Religious and communal structures might have provided continuity in the absence of centralized government. Unlike the United States, which produced large post-war federations such as the new California Republic, no canon record confirms a unified Mexican or Central American superstate in the centuries following the war. This absence does not preclude local governance or regional alliances. It suggests instead that reconstruction occurred on smaller scales, shaped by geography and necessity rather than continental ambition. Across deserts once marked by border fences and highways, Ruins would stand as reminders of intertwined destinies. The annexation of Canada had erased one border before the war. The devastation of Mexico and Central America blurred another. In the aftermath, survival mattered more than sovereignty. South of the American wasteland, communities likely endured beneath altered skies. They cultivated what land remained viable. They repaired what infrastructure could be salvaged. And like much of the world beyond the Commonwealth, they continued in relative silence, separated by oceans and decades from the northern territories whose war had set the planet alight. Far to the south of the equator, beyond the deserts and borderlands of North America, the vast continent of South America occupied a different position in the global order before the Great War. It was not one of the principal nuclear superpowers. It did not command the same military focus as the United States, China, or the fractured alliances of Europe. Yet it was deeply embedded within the global economy that was unraveling under the strain of resource scarcity. Many South American nations relied heavily on export industries. Oil from Venezuela, minerals from the Andes, agricultural products from Brazil and Argentina, and timber from the Amazon basin flowed outward through maritime trade networks. As the resource wars intensified and global shipping lanes became unstable, these economies contracted. Fuel shortages disrupted mechanized farming. International buyers dwindled. Political instability simmered in regions already managing economic inequality and social tension. Unlike Europe or East Asia, South America contained fewer concentrated nuclear targets. There were no sprawling missile fields comparable to those of North America or Eurasia. While certain nations maintained military capabilities, they were not central actors in the escalating standoff between the United States and China. This relative strategic distance may have reduced the likelihood of direct, large-scale nuclear targeting during the Great War. However, the absence of immediate missile strikes does not equate to safety. Fallout respects wind currents rather than borders. Atmospheric patterns would have carried radioactive particles across hemispheres. The global exchange of 2077 injected immense quantities of particulate matter into the upper atmosphere. Nuclear winter and climatic disruption affected all continents, including those not directly bombed. Agricultural systems across South America would have faced significant stress. The continent's fertile plains and tropical regions depend on stable rainfall and sunlight patterns. The dimming of skies and cooling of temperatures threatened harvest cycles. Even a slight reduction in growing season length can destabilize food supply for millions. Coastal cities such as Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Lima were densely populated and economically vital. While not primary military targets, their reliance on global trade made them vulnerable to collapse when maritime networks failed. Ports fell quiet. Imported fuel and machinery parts ceased to arrive. Electrical grids dependent on industrial maintenance began to fail. Inland regions may have offered greater resilience. Communities within the Andes Mountains, or deep within the Amazon basin, less dependent on global supply chains, could have adapted more readily. Traditional agricultural methods not reliant on heavy mechanization may have provided continuity. Access to freshwater rivers and biodiversity offered potential buffers against complete ecological collapse. The Amazon rainforest itself presents a complex case. While dense vegetation might have shielded some areas from immediate blast effects had any strikes occurred, long-term atmospheric disruption could have altered rainfall patterns significantly. Extended cooling or shifts in precipitation could have transformed ecosystems over decades. The delicate balance sustaining such biodiversity would have been tested by radiation and climate instability. Politically, the collapse of global superpowers may have created both risk and opportunity. Without external intervention or economic pressure from dominant nations, South American states could have turned inward to consolidate resources. Alternatively, internal rivalries might have intensified as fuel and food grew scarce. The absence of stable international trade removed an important stabilizing force. Over 2 centuries, it is plausible that regional federations or alliances emerged within the continent. Shared language and cultural ties across certain areas might have facilitated cooperation. However, no canonical record confirms the rise of a post-war South American superstate interacting with North America. The oceans, stripped of organized shipping and naval protection, became formidable barriers. Maritime travel between South America and other continents would have required functioning shipyards, fuel production, and navigational systems. After the Great War, such infrastructure would have been scarce. Even if coastal communities survived initial disruption, the capacity to rebuild intercontinental fleets would have taken generations, if it occurred at all. Culturally, South America's diverse societies would have woven the memory of global annihilation into existing narratives of colonization, revolution, and resilience. Oral traditions, music, and communal rituals may have preserved fragments of pre-war identity while adapting to new realities. The loss of global communication would have deepened regional identity, shifting focus from international integration to local survival. Environmental recovery patterns may have differed from those of heavily industrialized continents. With fewer concentrated nuclear strikes, certain ecosystems could have rebounded more quickly once atmospheric conditions stabilized. Wildlife populations might have expanded into areas previously urbanized. Rural communities could have integrated into these shifting landscapes more fluidly than dense metropolitan centers. Yet, even in regions spared direct targeting, the psychological weight of global isolation would have been profound. Knowing that entire continents had burned, that superpowers had collapsed into silence, would have reshaped worldview. Generations born after the war would have inherited a planet defined by distance rather than connection. The absence of confirmed South American expeditions to the North American wasteland suggests either enduring isolation or deliberate inward focus. Perhaps survival required conserving resources rather than risking dangerous voyages across irradiated seas. Perhaps no stable authority existed capable of organizing such journeys. What is most striking is not evidence of extinction, but of quiet endurance. South America, positioned away from the primary axis of superpower rivalry, may have avoided the worst initial devastation. Yet it could not escape the global consequences of atmospheric disruption and economic collapse. Its story, after 2077, likely unfolded in smaller scales, within valleys, along rivers, and beneath cooling skies. Beyond the familiar ruins of the Commonwealth, beneath different constellations and climates, the southern continent continued, changed, diminished, yet not erased. In the long silence after the bombs, its people would have faced the same essential question as all others: how to endure when the world they knew no longer existed. Scattered across warm seas between North and South America lie chains of islands that once thrived on trade, tourism, and maritime exchange. Cargo ships passed through narrow straits. Passenger liners docked beneath bright skies. Fishing fleets returned daily with reliable harvests. Its nations were not central players in the global contest for oil and power, yet they were deeply connected to the systems that sustained that contest. As energy shortages intensified during the resource wars, the Caribbean felt the tremors indirectly. Shipping traffic declined as fuel grew scarce. Imports became more expensive and less predictable. Economies reliant on tourism suffered as international travel slowed. Though geographically distant from primary battlefields, the region's stability was linked to the broader health of global trade. When the Great War erupted in 2077, the Caribbean's fate depended largely on proximity to strategic targets. Certain islands hosted military facilities tied to larger powers. Naval bases and airstrips across parts of the region would have drawn attention in a full-scale nuclear exchange. Installations considered extensions of American defense networks may have been targeted directly. Major population centers in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other larger islands were vulnerable due to density and infrastructure concentration. If missile strikes occurred against military assets, surrounding civilian areas would have suffered immense collateral damage. Shockwaves across narrow island landscapes leave little room for distance from impact. Yet many smaller islands lack strategic military value. Without missile silos, large air bases, or heavy industry, they may have avoided direct nuclear targeting. For these territories, the initial devastation of the Great War could have arrived more quietly through atmospheric change rather than explosive force. Fallout drifting from strikes across North America would have reached the Caribbean carried by prevailing winds. Contamination of rainwater and soil would have affected agriculture and freshwater supplies. Many islands depend on rainfall collection and shallow aquifers. Radioactive precipitation would have threatened drinking water in the months following detonation. The collapse of maritime networks had immediate consequences. Cargo shipments ceased. Imported fuel, medicine, and food no longer arrived. Islands dependent on external supplies faced acute shortages. Without fuel for generators, electrical grids failed, refrigeration systems stopped, communication infrastructure, reliant on satellite and undersea cable systems, fell silent. Fishing, once a primary source of sustenance, became uncertain. Oceanic contamination from nuclear fallout and the sinking of damaged vessels introduced new dangers. While some marine life may have adapted over time, the immediate aftermath likely saw reduced catches and fear of consuming contaminated seafood. However, island geography offers certain forms of resilience. Isolation that once demanded trade could, in the absence of global movement, become a protective boundary. Small populations accustomed to localized governance and community cooperation may have adapted more rapidly than densely populated mainland cities. Traditional agricultural methods, fishing knowledge, and communal resource sharing could have sustained enclaves through early years of scarcity. Tropical climates, though affected by nuclear winter, may have retained longer growing seasons compared to temperate regions. Rainfall patterns might have shifted, but access to year-round warmth provided an advantage over colder latitudes. Over the centuries that followed, the Caribbean likely became a constellation of independent enclaves. Without functional navies or industrial shipbuilding capacity, large-scale inter-island travel would have diminished. Small sail-powered vessels may have replaced motorized fleets. Trade between neighboring islands could have resumed slowly as contamination levels stabilized. The absence of recorded Caribbean fleets arriving in North America suggests enduring isolation. Whether due to limited resources or deliberate self-preservation, transoceanic voyages across irradiated waters would have been perilous. Fuel refinement requires infrastructure rarely available to small island communities after global collapse. Culturally, the region's rich heritage of resilience would have shaped post-war identity. Histories of colonialism, revolution, and adaptation to hurricanes and natural disaster provided narrative frameworks for understanding catastrophe. Music, oral storytelling, and communal rituals may have preserved fragments of pre-war memory even as global communication faded. In some areas, remnants of pre-war military facilities could have served as fortified settlements. Concrete bunkers and hardened runways might have offered shelter during the initial fallout period. Over time, such structures could have been repurposed into community centers or strongholds against environmental hazards. Yet the Caribbean's survival would have been precarious. Small landmass means limited redundancy. A single contaminated aquifer or failed harvest could threaten entire populations. Migration between islands may have occurred in search of better conditions, reshaping demographic patterns across the region. 2 centuries after the Great War, beneath skies that once carried passenger jets and now carry only seabirds, the islands likely endure in quieter forms. Palm trees may grow beside rusted docks. Coral reefs, altered by radiation and climate shifts, may slowly regenerate. Communities may gather along shorelines at dusk, recalling stories of a world that once moved endlessly across the sea. Beyond the American wasteland, beyond continental ruins, the the Caribbean remains part of that larger silence, not erased, but separated. Its waters, once busy with commerce, reflect empty horizons. And within that stillness, life persists in small, self-contained circles, shaped by the same distant fire that changed the world forever. Far across the Pacific, separated from the principal theaters of the resource wars by vast stretches of ocean, Australia and New Zealand occupied a different position within the pre-war world. They were not nuclear superpowers. They did not command the same concentration of missile fields or strategic rivalry as the United States, China, or the fractured alliances of Europe. Yet they were integrated into the same global economy built upon fossil energy and maritime trade. Australia, rich in mineral resources and geographically expansive, relied heavily on exports. Iron ore, coal, and agricultural goods flowed outward through shipping routes that connected it to Asia and beyond. As energy scarcity intensified and global trade contracted, those export channels narrowed. Fuel shortages disrupted transportation across the continent's immense interior. Coastal cities such as Sydney and Melbourne, dense with infrastructure and population, faced the same rising costs and rationing seen elsewhere. New Zealand, smaller and agriculturally focused, depended upon maritime connectivity for both imports and exports. Its isolation, once a defining characteristic, became increasingly pronounced as shipping lanes grew unstable. Economic contraction preceded the Great War, reshaping daily life through rationing and reduced industrial output. Strategically, both nations possessed military installations and alliances, yet neither stood at the center of the escalating Sino-American confrontation. The likelihood of direct nuclear targeting depended largely on whether foreign military assets were stationed within their territories. If American or Allied bases operated on Australian soil, those facilities could have been considered valid targets during a global exchange. Major urban centers, though less numerous than in other continents, remained vulnerable due to population density and infrastructure concentration. A strike against a single coastal city would have had sweeping consequences for national stability. Ports, shipyards, and airfields represented both economic lifelines and potential military objectives. However, compared to densely packed regions of Europe or East Asia, Australia's vast interior offered significant geographic dispersion. Much of the continent consists of arid or semi-arid terrain with low population density. Remote communities in the outback, distant from major military assets, may have avoided direct blast damage. Similarly, parts of New Zealand's rural landscape, characterized by mountains and farmland, could have experienced reduced targeting risk. Yet even in areas untouched by immediate detonations, the consequences of the Great War would have arrived through atmospheric and economic collapse. Nuclear winter would not have respected hemispheric distance. Particulate matter injected into the atmosphere would have spread globally, reducing sunlight and altering rainfall patterns. Australia's delicate balance between arid interior and coastal fertility would have been disrupted. Droughts or unseasonal cold could have threatened agriculture. New Zealand's temperate climate may have buffered some immediate climatic extremes, yet prolonged cooling and reduced sunlight would still have affected crop yields. Pastoral farming, reliant on consistent grass growth, would have suffered under altered seasonal cycles. Food security, once tied to stable export markets, would have required rapid local adaptation. The collapse of global maritime networks had profound consequences for both nations. As island and continental states reliant on shipping, their connection to the broader world was severed almost instantly. Imported fuel, machinery parts, and manufactured goods ceased to arrive. Naval and air fleets, dependent on refined fuel, would have faced gradual immobilization. In the absence of large-scale nuclear devastation, Australia and New Zealand may have experienced a different kind of collapse, slower, yet equally transformative. Urban populations confronted with energy failure and supply shortages would have faced migration pressures. Some may have moved toward rural areas seeking agricultural sustenance. Coastal cities could have diminished as trade became impossible. Over 2 centuries, geographic isolation might have shifted from vulnerability to protection. Without immediate neighbors pressing against borders, communities could have reorganized regionally. Australia's states, once unified under federal governance, might have evolved into semi-autonomous territories centered around viable water sources and arable land. New Zealand's smaller population and cohesive geography may have allowed for tighter community reconstruction. The oceans surrounding these lands present both barrier and opportunity. With industrial shipbuilding capacity diminished, transoceanic voyages would have been rare and dangerous. However, smaller vessels powered by wind could have facilitated limited coastal travel. Interactions between Australia and New Zealand may have resumed gradually through sail rather than fuel. Environmental transformation across the region would have been complex. Australia's unique wildlife, already adapted to harsh climates, may have responded unpredictably to radiation and climate shifts. Some species could have thrived in reduced human presence. Others may have struggled under ecological disruption. New Zealand's isolated ecosystems, historically vulnerable to external change, would have faced similar challenges. Canon provides no confirmation of post-war contact between Australia, New Zealand, and North America. The absence suggests prolonged self-containment rather than extinction. In a world where even continental powers struggle to rebuild fleets, distant island nations would have focused inward. Culturally, both societies would have carried memories of global catastrophe filtered through local experience. Their distance from the principal axis of superpower rivalry may have fostered a narrative of having witnessed the end of the world from afar, yet still endured its consequences. Generations born after the war would inherit landscapes marked less by cratered cities and more by slow environmental adaptation. Under southern skies, beneath constellations rarely visible in the northern hemisphere, communities may have gathered beside quiet coastlines and vast plains. They would have known that beyond the horizon lay continents reduced to ruin. Yet their own survival would depend not on reaching those distant shores, but on tending to the land and sea immediately around them. In that quiet endurance, Australia and New Zealand would stand as distant echoes of a world once connected by constant movement. After the fire, they remained changed, isolated, and shaped by the same atmospheric shadow that fell across every nation, no matter how far from the original flash. East of China, across narrow seas lined with dense cities and advanced industry, lay the island nation of Japan and the broader arc of East Asia. Before the Great War, this region stood at the forefront of technological development. Robotics, electronics, and advanced manufacturing defined its economic strength. Urban corridors stretched almost continuously along coastlines, linking ports to industrial hubs in patterns of constant motion. Japan, in particular, was characterized by high population density and deep integration into global trade networks. Its cities depended on imported energy resources and raw materials. As fossil fuel reserves declined and the resource wars intensified, that dependence became a liability. Shipping lanes grew unstable. Imports slowed. The nation's advanced industrial base strained under shortages. Politically, Japan existed within the gravitational pull of both American and Chinese influence. Its proximity to China and long-standing security ties with the United States placed it in a delicate position as tensions escalated. Military installations, both domestic and allied, dotted parts of its territory. Air bases and naval ports linked it to broader Pacific defense strategies. In the years leading to 2077, the Pacific region became increasingly militarized. Submarine patrols expanded, early warning systems intensified. The narrow distances between East Asian nations meant that any escalation could have immediate regional consequences. The Pacific was not a vast buffer, it was a corridor of confrontation. When the Great War ignited, Japan's fate would have been determined by both alliance and proximity. If Allied military assets were present on its soil, those facilities would have represented strategic targets. Major urban centers such as Tokyo and Osaka, dense with infrastructure and population, were vulnerable not only as symbolic sites but as logistical hubs connected to global systems. The detonation of even a small number of nuclear warheads over such concentrated cities would have been catastrophic. Shockwaves across limited landmass leave little room for distance from impact. Fires spread rapidly through urban districts built upon tightly packed architecture. Infrastructure collapse in a highly interconnected metropolitan environment magnifies cascading failures. Beyond Japan, the Korean peninsula faced its own precarious position. Historically divided and militarized, it existed at the crossroads of Chinese and American strategic interest. Missile sites, airfields, and defensive installations made it a likely participant in nuclear targeting calculations. Its dense population and narrow geography heightened vulnerability. Southeast Asia, while less central to nuclear arsenals, remained deeply affected by proximity. Nations such as Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines were integrated into Pacific trade routes and geopolitical alliances. Some hosted foreign military facilities. Others depended heavily on maritime commerce. Direct targeting may have varied, but fallout and economic collapse would have reached all. Radiation drifting from strikes across East Asia would have traveled across seas and borders alike. Agricultural regions across Japan and Southeast Asia, dependent on stable climate and rainfall, would have faced disruption from nuclear winter. Rice cultivation, central to much of the region's sustenance, is particularly sensitive to seasonal variation. Reduced sunlight and altered temperature patterns could have devastated harvest cycles. The collapse of shipping networks struck at the heart of East Asia's economic model. Ports that once received constant flows of goods fell silent. Fuel shortages immobilized fleets. Industrial machinery, reliant on imported components, gradually ceased functioning. Urban populations accustomed to dense living and global connectivity faced sudden isolation. Yet the region also possessed deep traditions of adaptation. Communities familiar with typhoons, earthquakes, and war had long practiced resilience. Small-scale agriculture, fishing, and communal cooperation may have provided foundations for survival in rural areas. Mountainous terrain in parts of Japan and Southeast Asia could have offered partial protection from blast effects in certain scenarios. Over the centuries that followed, East Asia likely experienced varied outcomes. Heavily industrialized urban corridors may have remained irradiated for decades, limiting resettlement. Rural villages, less directly targeted, could have persisted. Coastal settlements may have returned to sail-based maritime trade once radiation levels diminished. The absence of confirmed post-war East Asian fleets appearing in North American waters suggests prolonged regional focus. Rebuilding transoceanic capability requires industrial-scale production of ships, fuel, and navigational systems. After widespread devastation and climatic disruption, such reconstruction would have been slow. Cultural memory across the region would have absorbed the Great War into existing narratives of conflict and renewal. Stories of atomic devastation would resonate with historical echoes. Yet the scale of global annihilation in 2077 would have eclipsed prior experience. Generations born beneath altered skies would inherit both technological remnants and fractured infrastructure. It is possible that small regional states or federations emerged in isolated pockets, particularly in areas less densely targeted. Japan's island geography, though vulnerable to concentrated strikes, also limits the spread of certain land-based conflict. Southeast Asia's diverse terrain may have fostered localized governance rather than continental consolidation. What remains most consistent with the broader pattern of the post-war world is isolation. Across the Pacific, Beyond American shores, no organized East Asian superstate appears to have reasserted itself globally. Oceans once crossed daily by cargo vessels became silent expanses once more. Under different constellations and coastal winds, survivors in Japan and East Asia would have faced the same essential challenge as others, rebuilding life from fragments. Dense cities reduced to skeletal frames, mountain villages preserving agricultural cycles, ports reclaimed by tide and rust. The Great War did not spare the Pacific Rim. It folded it into the same long silence that now defines the rest of the world beyond the wasteland. Along the arc that stretches from the Korean peninsula down through the jungles and archipelagos of Southeast Asia, the world before the Great War was defined by density, diversity, and motion. Trade routes threaded through narrow seas. Cargo ships passed through straits that connected the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Cities rose along coastlines where rivers met the sea. Though not the central architects of the final nuclear exchange, these nations stood close to its tremors. The Korean Peninsula, already shaped by division and militarization in earlier centuries, occupied a precarious position between major powers. Military installations, air defense systems, and fortified borders were part of its landscape long before 2077. In an era of escalating tension between China and the United States, such infrastructure made the peninsula strategically significant. Missile sites, radar stations, and airfields would have been identified in any targeting matrix that considered allied and opposing capabilities across East Asia. When the Great War began, it is likely that portions of the peninsula suffered direct strikes. Even limited detonations across such a narrow geography would have had immense consequence. Dense urban centers, industrial zones, and military compounds lie close together, leaving little buffer between strategic target and civilian population. Shockwaves would have traveled rapidly across hills and valleys. Fires, once ignited in crowded districts, would have spread with devastating efficiency. Further south, across Southeast Asia, the pattern of impact would have been more uneven. Nations such as Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines were deeply integrated into global trade networks, but were not primary nuclear powers. Some hosted foreign military facilities, naval access points, or air bases linked to broader Pacific strategies. Those installations could have drawn targeted strikes, particularly if aligned with one of the superpowers. Yet many regions across Southeast Asia consisted of rural farmland, jungle, and island communities without heavy military infrastructure. In these areas, the initial catastrophe may have arrived less through explosion and more through atmospheric change. Fallout drifting from strikes across China, Japan, and the Pacific would have carried contamination into skies far from primary target. Rainfall patterns could have transported radioactive particles into river systems that sustain millions. Rice paddies across the Mekong Delta and other fertile basins depend on stable seasonal cycles. Nuclear winter, even if moderate in tropical latitudes, would have altered temperature and sunlight enough to threaten harvests. Reduced yields across densely populated regions would have led quickly to scarcity. Urban centers such as Manila, Bangkok, and Jakarta, reliant on continuous supply chains, would have faced immediate pressure as imports ceased. The collapse of maritime networks struck Southeast Asia with particular force. The Strait of Malacca, once one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, would have fallen silent. Tankers and cargo vessels ceased to move. Fuel reserves dwindled rapidly. Electrical grids dependent on imported oil or gas faltered. Without replacement parts and steady energy input, industrial capacity shrank. In archipelagic nations such as Indonesia and the Philippines, inter-island travel itself depended on fuel. As supplies vanished, communities became more isolated from one another. Remote islands may have survived with limited external support, relying on fishing and local agriculture. Larger cities, however, would have struggled to feed concentrated populations without maritime resupply. Jungle and mountainous terrain across Southeast Asia may have offered both challenge and refuge. Dense forests could shield smaller settlements from some fallout patterns depending on wind direction. Rivers, though vulnerable to contamination, also provide lifelines for transport and irrigation. Communities accustomed to subsistence farming and fishing may have adapted more readily than those fully dependent on industrial systems. Over the centuries that followed, the region likely fragmented into localized enclaves shaped by geography. In mountainous highlands, small communities could have persisted with relative autonomy. Along coastlines, fishing villages may have re-emerged once ocean contamination decreased. Urban ruins might have stood as hollow reminders of a hyper-connected world abruptly severed. The Korean Peninsula's future would have depended heavily on the extent of direct targeting. If large portions of industrial infrastructure were destroyed, rebuilding centralized authority would have been difficult. Regional commanders or community leaders might have governed fragmented territories. Borders that once divided north and south may have lost meaning in the face of shared devastation. Across Southeast Asia, the absence of confirmed post-war fleets or diplomatic contact with North America suggests prolonged regional focus. Rebuilding long-distance naval capacity requires stable industrial bases and refined fuel production. After widespread collapse, such capabilities would have taken generations to restore, if at all. Culturally, the region's long histories of adaptation to conflict and colonial disruption may have shaped post-war identity. Oral traditions and communal structures could have preserved continuity amid technological loss. Spiritual and social networks may have offered cohesion when centralized governments faltered. In the end, the arc from Korea to the Indonesian archipelago did not escape the shadow of the Great War. Whether struck directly or reshaped by atmospheric aftermath, these lands entered the same era of isolation as the rest of the planet. Beneath humid skies and monsoon rains altered by distant detonations, life persisted in smaller circles. Beyond the American wasteland, beyond even the Pacific Rim, Southeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula carried their own quiet chapters of survival. Cities once alive with neon and traffic became skeletal outlines. Rivers continued to flow. Forests reclaimed abandoned roads. And in villages tucked between mountains and sea, communities endured beneath a world permanently dimmed by fire. Across the vast expanse of the African continent, the decades before the Great War unfolded under pressures both familiar and distinct. Africa was rich in natural resources, minerals, rare metals, and energy reserves, yet much of its industrial output was tied to foreign demand. Global trade connected its ports to Europe, Asia, and the Americas. When that trade began to fracture during the resource wars, the effects rippled unevenly across regions. Unlike the major nuclear powers, most African nations did not possess extensive missile arsenals or global military projection. Their strategic significance lay more in resource extraction and trade corridors than in direct participation in the escalating standoff between superpowers. Oil from North Africa and parts of West Africa remained valuable as global reserves dwindled. Minerals critical to advanced technology were exported outward to sustain industrial centers abroad. As energy shortages intensified globally, foreign interest in securing African resources likely grew sharper. Political pressure, economic coercion, and localized conflict may have increased in regions rich with oil or rare materials. Yet, Africa's vast geography and varied political landscapes meant that no single pattern defined the entire continent. Some states experienced relative stability under centralized control. Others navigated internal unrest amplified by shrinking global markets. The dissolution of international institutions removed a stabilizing framework that had once mediated disputes. Without coordinated diplomacy, foreign powers may have turned to unilateral agreements or covert influence to maintain access to materials. Military presence in certain coastal regions could have expanded quietly, tying parts of the continent indirectly into broader strategic networks. However, Africa's relative distance from the primary axis of Sino-American hostility may have reduced its likelihood of concentrated nuclear targeting. Major missile fields and strategic bomber bases were not clustered across its territory in the same manner as in North America, Europe, or East Asia. This does not imply immunity, but it suggests that the scale of direct strikes could have been more limited. When the Great War erupted in 2077, the continent's experience would have varied widely. North African nations closer to Europe and the Mediterranean may have faced greater risk if military installations were present. Coastal cities involved in strategic shipping lanes could have been struck if perceived as extensions of Allied networks. Yet large interior regions, deserts, savannas, and highlands may have avoided direct blast effects. The absence of widespread missile targeting would not have shielded Africa from global atmospheric consequences. Nuclear winter would have altered rainfall patterns across the continent. In regions dependent on seasonal monsoons, even slight shifts in precipitation could have threatened agriculture. The Sahel, already vulnerable to drought, might have experienced intensified aridity. Other regions could have seen unseasonal cold or disrupted planting cycles. The collapse of maritime trade struck African economies deeply. Ports along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, once vibrant with cargo ships, fell silent. Imported fuel and manufactured goods ceased to arrive. Mining operations reliant on global demand slowed or halted entirely. Urban centers dependent on trade revenue faced economic contraction and resource scarcity. Yet Africa's diversity of climate and subsistence practices may have offered pockets of resilience. In rural communities where agriculture was less mechanized and more reliant on traditional methods, adaptation to fuel scarcity may have been less abrupt. Knowledge of local water sources and crop rotation could have sustained populations even as global systems failed. Regions rich in freshwater lakes and river systems, such as those surrounding the Nile or the Great Lakes, would have faced contamination risks from fallout carried by atmospheric currents. However, depending on wind patterns and the absence of direct strikes, some waterways may have remained viable with careful management. Communities along these rivers might have reorganized around localized governance and resource sharing. Over the centuries following the war, Africa's immense scale and varied terrain could have encouraged regional autonomy rather than continental unification. Desert caravans, once replaced by motorized transport, may have re-emerged in new forms. Coastal fishing communities might have resumed small-scale maritime trade once ocean conditions stabilized. Inland agricultural societies could have persisted largely independent of former global hierarchies. Canon provides no clear evidence of African expeditions reaching North American shores after the war. The absence suggests enduring inward focus or limited industrial capacity to rebuild long-distance fleets. Re-establishing transoceanic travel requires stable shipyards, refined fuel, and coordinated governance resources, likely scarce in the immediate aftermath. Culturally, survivors across Africa would have interpreted the Great War through diverse historical lenses. Memories of colonial exploitation and global imbalance may have framed the catastrophe as the culmination of distant rivalries. Oral traditions, communal leadership structures, and adaptive social networks could have provided continuity amid uncertainty. In some regions, former foreign military facilities may have been repurposed as fortified settlements. In others, abandoned industrial sites would stand as silent monuments to a world once connected by extraction and export. Wildlife patterns may have shifted in response to reduced human activity and climatic disruption, altering ecosystems in unpredictable ways. 2 centuries later, beneath equatorial suns and desert stars, life likely continues across the continent in forms reshaped by isolation. The Great War did not revolve around Africa, yet it touched it nonetheless. Through altered climate, economic collapse, and drifting fallout, the continent entered the same long era of fragmentation experienced elsewhere. Beyond the familiar ruins of America, Africa's story remains largely untold in surviving records, not because it vanished, but because the oceans between continents grew wide again. In that distance lies the quiet suggestion that survival endured, dispersed across deserts, forests, and river valleys, beneath skies forever changed by distant fire. When the flashes on distant horizons faded and the world settled into its long twilight, Africa entered the post-war centuries shaped less by concentrated blast zones and more by slow transformation. The continent's relative distance from the primary nuclear superpowers may have spared it from the heaviest immediate targeting, yet it could not escape the global consequences of atmospheric disruption and economic collapse. The first years after 2077 would have been marked by uncertainty. News of annihilated capitals and vanished governments would have spread through fragmentary radio transmissions before falling silent. Ports that once connected Africa to Europe, Asia, and the Americas stood empty. Fuel imports ceased. Industrial machinery slowed and then stopped. Economies tied to extraction and export collapsed into subsistence. In northern regions along the Mediterranean, fallout drifting from Europe may have settled over coastal cities. Agricultural land, already limited by aridity, would have suffered additional stress. Yet deeper inland, across vast desert expanses and savannas, the absence of dense strategic targets may have reduced direct contamination. The Sahara, already inhospitable, may have remained largely unchanged in immediate physical form, though altered rainfall patterns could have shifted its boundaries. Sub-Saharan Africa's response to nuclear winter would have depended heavily on regional climate. Cooler global temperatures and reduced sunlight could have shortened growing seasons in areas accustomed to steady warmth. Crops dependent on predictable rainfall may have failed during early years of atmospheric instability. Famine, not blast, would have been the primary threat. However, many African communities practiced agriculture and pastoralism, less dependent on industrial inputs than heavily mechanized nations. Traditional farming techniques, diversified crops, and local seed preservation could have provided resilience. Livestock herding, adjusted to shifting climate patterns, might have sustained populations where monoculture systems elsewhere collapsed. Urban centers across the continent faced more severe disruption. Cities such as Cairo, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg relied on complex infrastructure and international trade. When global supply chains dissolved, food and medicine shortages would have followed quickly. Power grids, dependent on imported fuel or centralized plants, faltered. In some regions, hydroelectric systems tied to major rivers may have continued to function for a time, offering limited stability. Water remained central to survival. River systems like the Nile, the Congo, and the Niger provided lifelines across wide territories. If not heavily contaminated by fallout, these waterways could have supported regional enclaves. Communities might have reorganized along riverbanks, prioritizing irrigation and transport by smaller, non-mechanized vessels. Political structures in the immediate aftermath likely fragmented along regional lines. Central governments, weakened by economic collapse, may have ceded authority to provincial leaders, tribal councils, or military remnants. The absence of external intervention from former global powers created space for internal realignment. Some areas may have stabilized under strong local governance. Others could have faced prolonged instability. Over decades, ecological patterns may have shifted in complex ways. Reduced industrial activity worldwide could have lowered certain pollutants even as radiation lingered in pockets. Wildlife populations might have expanded into areas abandoned by urban dwellers. National parks and remote wilderness zones could have become refuges, not only for animals, but for human communities seeking isolation from fallout zones. The absence of confirmed African fleets appearing in distant wastelands suggests that continental focus remained inward. Maritime reconstruction requires steel, fuel refinement, and coordinated labor on an industrial scale. In a world where many urban centers struggled simply to maintain water and food, transoceanic ambition would have seemed distant. Trade between neighboring African regions may have resumed gradually through overland caravans and river travel. Without reliance on global markets, economies may have recalibrated toward local exchange. Mining operations, if restarted, would likely have served nearby communities rather than distant nations. Culturally, the post-war centuries may have fostered a recentering of tradition. Oral histories would absorb the Great War into existing narratives of hardship and renewal. Communities long accustomed to adapting to drought and political change may have drawn upon those experiences. Rituals and storytelling could have provided continuity where technology failed. The diversity of Africa means that no single outcome defines its future. Coastal enclaves might have rebuilt fishing economies once ocean contamination decreased. Highland communities in Ethiopia or the Great Rift Valley could have sustained agriculture under altered climates. Desert settlements may have relied on ancient water sourcing techniques, refined over generations. In regions where foreign military installations once stood, their ruins may have been repurposed as fortifications or sources of salvage. Concrete bunkers and airfields, stripped of their original purpose, could have sheltered new societies. Elsewhere, abandoned ports rusted beneath sun and salt, reminders of a global system that no longer existed. 2 centuries after the bombs fell, Africa likely remained a continent of varied stories rather than a unified post-war empire. Some regions may have achieved relative stability, forming confederations or localized states. Others might have remained sparsely populated, shaped more by climate than by politics. Beyond the familiar American ruins, beneath equatorial skies and desert stars, Africa endured not as a central battlefield, but as a participant in global aftermath. It absorbed the atmospheric shadow of distant detonations and reshaped itself quietly. In valleys, along rivers, and across plains where the land was not cratered by warheads, life continued altered, challenged, yet persistent. The silence between continents does not imply absence. It suggests separation. And across Africa's immense landscapes, separated from the American wasteland by wide oceans and decades of isolation, communities likely rebuilt in forms less visible but no less real beneath a world permanently changed. At the edges of the known world, where ice meets sea and population thins to scattered outposts, the Arctic and other remote regions occupied a peculiar place in the final years before the Great War. These were not centers of culture or dense industry, yet they were deeply tied to global strategy. Early warning radar arrays stood against polar winds. Submarine routes traced silent paths beneath frozen waters. Remote airfields and listening stations monitored the sky for signs of incoming fire. In the decades of escalating tension, the Arctic became an arena of quiet vigilance. Nuclear powers relied upon polar trajectories for intercontinental missiles. Submarines equipped with nuclear payloads slipped beneath ice sheets to remain undetected. Bunkers carved into permafrost housed communication equipment designed to survive electromagnetic disruption. Though sparsely populated, the region held immense strategic significance. When the Great War erupted in 2077, the Arctic likely felt its tremors immediately. Missile paths arced across polar skies. Radar stations designed to detect launches may have registered their final alerts before being silenced. Installations considered essential to retaliation capacity would have been targeted. Even limited detonations in such fragile environments would have had outsized ecological impact. Yet the Arctic's vastness and low population density may have reduced civilian casualties compared to major cities elsewhere. Remote settlements in northern Canada, Greenland, Siberia, and Scandinavia were scattered and small. Some may have been spared direct strikes if located far from strategic facilities. For those communities, the first signs of catastrophe may have arrived as distant flashes and sudden loss of communication rather than immediate blast. The extreme climate introduced additional layers of complexity. Infrastructure in polar regions, depends heavily on consistent energy supply. Generators maintain heating systems essential for survival. When global fuel distribution collapsed, even settlements untouched by nuclear fire faced existential threat. Without power, winter cold becomes lethal within days. Submarine fleets operating beneath Arctic ice present another dimension of survival and uncertainty. Nuclear-powered vessels are capable of extended autonomy, carrying provisions and generating their own energy. In the aftermath of global exchange, such submarines may have remained functional for weeks, months, or even years, isolated from shattered command structures. Whether their crews returned to irradiated ports or chose to remain at sea for as long as supplies allowed remains unknown. Ice sheets and snowfields may have temporarily limited the spread of fallout in certain areas, trapping radioactive particles within frozen layers. However, seasonal thaw would have reintroduced contamination into rivers and coastal waters. The delicate balance of Arctic ecosystems, already vulnerable to climate fluctuation, would have shifted under the combined weight of radiation and atmospheric cooling. Beyond the Arctic proper, other remote regions across the globe, mountain ranges, deserts, deep forests, shared similar patterns. Areas distant from strategic targets and major industrial hubs may have avoided immediate devastation. Small communities living with limited dependence on centralized infrastructure could have adapted more readily than metropolitan population. In high mountain villages across the Himalayas, Andes, or other ranges, isolation may have served as protection. Limited road access and sparse military presence reduced targeting probability. Yet survival still depended on stable climate. Nuclear winter would have shortened growing seasons and intensified cold in already harsh environments. Remote islands in the Pacific or Indian Oceans, lacking strategic value, might have experienced minimal direct blast damage. Their greatest challenges would have been contamination of rainwater and collapse of trade. With limited landmass and resources, adaptation required careful stewardship of what remained. The Arctic region's long-term fate would have been shaped by both devastation and endurance. Over time, these hardened facilities could have evolved into isolated enclaves, sustained by fishing, hunting, and carefully managed energy systems. 2 centuries after the war, the polar skies may appear deceptively unchanged. Ice still glows beneath pale sunlight. Northern lights ripple across winter darkness. Yet beneath that beauty lies the memory of missiles that once traced arcs overhead. Radar towers stand silent, rusting in snow. Abandoned airstrips fade into white expanses. The absence of organized Arctic fleets traveling south suggests that whatever survived there remained largely inward-focused. Rebuilding global communication from such remote positions would have required industrial capacity and stable networks far beyond isolated enclaves. In the end, the Arctic and other remote regions embody a paradox of the Great War. They were both central to its strategic calculus and peripheral to its population centers. They witnessed the exchange not from crowded streets, but from frozen silence. Their survival depended not on vault networks or urban reconstruction, but on resilience against cold and isolation. Across tundra and mountain pass, life may have endured quietly, small groups adapting to long winters and altered seasons. Hunters moving across snow where once satellites passed overhead. In those distant places, far from the Commonwealth and the deserts of the American West, the world did not end in noise alone. It ended in silence carried on polar winds. When the Great War unfolded across continents, the oceans did not ignite in the same way cities did. There were no skylines to collapse beneath the waves, no highways reduced to craters. Yet the seas were not untouched. They became vast receivers of fallout, graveyards of fleets, and silent witnesses to the collapse of global movement. Before 2077, the oceans were arteries of commerce and military projection. Tankers transported the last reserves of oil across hemispheres. Aircraft carriers patrolled contested waters, Submarines traced hidden routes beneath thermal layers. Fishing fleets harvested coastal regions to feed growing populations. The sea connected nations more reliably than any road or rail line. When nuclear missiles launched, many naval vessels were already at sea. Some were part of strategic deterrence fleets, armed and waiting. Others were cargo ships, mid-transit between ports that would soon cease to exist. In the immediate aftermath of detonation, electromagnetic pulses disrupted navigation systems. Ports were destroyed. Communication with command structures vanished. Submarines powered by nuclear reactors possessed a rare advantage. They could remain submerged for extended periods without refueling. Crews sealed within steel hulls may have learned of the world's destruction through fragmented transmissions. Some would have been ordered to launch retaliatory strikes. Others, cut off from command, may have lingered beneath the surface, uncertain of where to return. Surface fleets faced harsher realities. Aircraft carriers and destroyers rely on complex supply chains for maintenance, ammunition, and food. With ports irradiated and shipyards destroyed, even intact vessels became stranded. Crews eventually would have been forced to make landfall along devastated coastlines or abandon ships to drift. The oceans themselves absorbed immense quantities of radioactive fallout. Dust and particulate matter carried by atmospheric currents settled into waves. Rain washed contamination into rivers, which then emptied into seas. Coastal waters near major strike zones likely experienced higher concentrations of radioactive material. Marine ecosystems, delicate and interdependent, were disrupted. Fish and other marine life would have responded unpredictably. Some species may have suffered mass die-offs in heavily contaminated zones. Others, particularly those in deeper waters less exposed to surface fallout, might have endured with fewer immediate effects. Over time, radiation would have dispersed unevenly through currents, creating pockets of higher and lower contamination. Fishing communities along coastlines across the globe faced difficult choices. With terrestrial agriculture failing in many regions, the sea offered potential sustenance. Yet fear of contamination and mutation altered patterns of consumption. Some coastal populations may have continued fishing cautiously, relying on traditional knowledge to avoid visibly affected waters. Others abandoned maritime livelihoods altogether. Shipwrecks accumulated beneath waves. Vessels damaged by electromagnetic pulse or abandoned due to lack of fuel drifted until storms claimed them. Naval battles may have occurred in the chaotic hours after launch, leaving wreckage scattered across strategic corridors. Over decades, these wrecks became artificial reefs or hazardous obstacles for any future mariners. The collapse of global shipping transformed the oceans from highways into barriers. Before the war, crossing the Atlantic or Pacific was routine. Afterward, without fuel production and coordinated navigation systems, such journeys became rare and perilous. Refining petroleum requires stable infrastructure, unlikely to survive concentrated strikes. Nuclear-powered vessels, once symbols of technological mastery, eventually required maintenance beyond isolated cruise capacity. Coastal cities across every continent felt the secondary consequences. Ports that once pulsed with activity grew silent. Without maritime trade, food and materials ceased to flow between regions. Coastal economies contracted, harbors filled with rusting hulls tethered to docks that would never again see steady traffic. Over 2 centuries, oceanic contamination likely decreased gradually as radioactive isotopes decayed and dispersed. Currents diluted concentrations. Marine ecosystems adapted. Certain mutations may have occurred, reshaping species in subtle or dramatic ways. Stories from coastal settlements may speak of creatures altered by radiation, though life in the deep sea, insulated from surface events, may have changed less dramatically. Yet the oceans retained their vastness. Even in a shattered world, they remained expansive, and difficult to traverse. For post-war societies attempting to rebuild, the cost of constructing seaworthy fleets with reliable fuel sources would have been immense. Coastal enclaves may have developed small sail-powered vessels for local travel, but transoceanic voyages remained unlikely. The few hints of surviving submarines suggest that fragments of pre-war naval power endured in isolation. A stealth submarine operating along American shores generations later indicates that some crews remained operational long after the exchange. Whether similar vessels patrolled other coasts, unknown and unseen, remains within the realm of possibility. Beneath the surface, where sunlight fades into darkness, the oceans hold the remnants of a world once defined by connection. Steel hulls rest on seabeds. Containers filled with forgotten goods lie scattered across sand. Coral slowly envelops the edges of aircraft carriers that once projected power across continents. Above, waves continue to rise and fall, indifferent to former borders. For survivors along coastlines, the sea is both memory and mystery. It marks the edge of known territory. It separates continents that no longer speak, and though it did not burn as cities burned, it absorbed the shadow of that fire, carrying its trace through currents that circle the globe. In the quiet centuries after the Great War, the oceans became reminders of distance. Once pathways of constant exchange, they returned to ancient stillness. Between ruined continents, they stretch wide and silent, holding within their depths the echoes of a civilization that once believed it could master them. High above the burning continents, beyond the reach of shockwaves and collapsing cities, humanity had once extended its presence into orbit. Satellites circled the planet in quiet precision. Space stations housed research crews. Military platforms monitored missile trajectories and relayed encrypted communications across hemispheres. Before the Great War, space was not merely symbolic achievement. It was woven into the infrastructure of modern civilization. By the final decades before 2077, orbital assets played essential roles in navigation, communication, and defense. Early warning satellites detected missile launches. Surveillance platforms observed troop movements. Civilian networks relied on constellations of devices to transmit data and coordinate global trade. Above the atmosphere, steel structures drifted in calculated paths, sustained by automated systems and occasional human oversight. When the first missiles launched during the Great War, the sky itself became a battlefield of information. Satellites registered heat signatures and trajectories within seconds. Commands were transmitted downward to initiate retaliatory strikes. Yet as electromagnetic pulses rippled through the upper atmosphere and ground-based infrastructure collapsed, many of those orbital systems began to fail. Satellites are not immortal. They require maintenance, course correction, and periodic replacement. Without functioning ground control stations, their orbits gradually decayed. Some burned harmlessly upon re-entry, streaking briefly across skies already glowing with distant fire. Others remained aloft for years, silent relics circling a world that no longer listened. Space stations present a more intimate story. Crews stationed above Earth at the moment of nuclear exchange would have witnessed the catastrophe from an impossible vantage point. Communication networks blinking out one by one. Attempts to contact mission control met only static. Supplies aboard such stations are finite. Oxygen, water, and food depend upon resupply missions that would never come. In the weeks following the exchange, astronauts and technicians in orbit would have faced a stark realization. The world below had changed irreversibly. If stations possessed re-entry vehicles, crews might have attempted descent, aiming for landing zones whose condition they could not verify. Without clear guidance, re-entry into a devastated planet would have been uncertain and dangerous. Certain military programs may have extended beyond civilian space stations. References to orbital platforms and experimental weapons suggest that elements of pre-war governments envisioned strategic advantage in space. If such installations existed and were operational at the moment of detonation, they too would have been severed from command structures. Autonomous systems may have continued functioning for limited periods before degrading. There are hints within surviving records of advanced technological projects that reached beyond Earth's surface. Some speak of satellites carrying weapons or surveillance arrays tied to shadowy organizations. Whether these assets remained active long after the war or decayed into uselessness remains uncertain. Without ground support and repair capacity, even hardened military hardware eventually fails. Over time, orbital debris accumulated. Satellites drifting out of alignment collided or fragmented. The sky above the wasteland may occasionally glow with faint streaks as remnants re-entered the atmosphere. For survivors below, such lights could appear as falling stars or omens rather than artifacts of a lost network. Space programs require industrial capacity and stable governance. Launch facilities, rocket fuel production, precision manufacturing. These depend on a coordinated society. After 2077, such coordination vanished across most of the globe. Rebuilding the ability to reach orbit would have demanded resources and expertise beyond the reach of fragmented enclaves. The idea that remnants of pre-war authority survived in orbit persists in scattered rumors. A station continuing to circle for decades, its crew adapting to isolation. A satellite network maintained by automated systems long after its creators were gone, yet without confirmed contact or visible intervention. These possibilities remain suspended in uncertainty. From the perspective of the American wasteland, the sky appears empty save for weather and occasional atmospheric anomalies. No organized fleet descends from orbit to reclaim territory. No orbital authority broadcasts decrees. The silence suggests that whatever once circled above either perished with its support systems or remains powerless to alter events below. Still, the image of Earth from orbit on the day of the Great War is haunting to consider. A blue sphere marked by expanding blooms of light, continents glowing where cities once stood, clouds streaked with particulate shadow. Those who might have witnessed that sight firsthand would have carried knowledge of global devastation unmatched by anyone on the surface. In the centuries that followed, as satellites fell and stations decayed, the heavens gradually returned to their older simplicity. Stars shone unobstructed by active communication arrays. The artificial constellations of human engineering dimmed one by one. The sky over the wasteland became once again a canvas of natural light. Above ruined capitals and silent oceans, the final remnants of humanity's reach into space either burned away or drifted endlessly. It severed the fragile threads connecting Earth to orbit. And in that severance, humanity's highest vantage point was lost to the same quiet that settled over every land below. In the years before the Great War, the world's governments did not place all their faith in missiles and armies. Beneath mountains, under deserts, and deep within bedrock, they carved spaces meant to endure what cities could not. Bunkers, continuity facilities, and hardened command centers were constructed across multiple continents. Some were public knowledge, others existed only within classified files and sealed corridors. These installations were designed for survival at the highest levels of leadership. Reinforced doors, independent power systems, and sealed air filtration promised protection against blast and fallout. Food reserves were calculated to last months or years. Communication arrays were shielded to withstand electromagnetic pulse. Within these subterranean chambers, governments intended to outlast the storm and reassert authority once the skies cleared. When the missiles launched in 2077, such facilities were activated across the globe. Heads of state, military officers, and select staff descended below ground. In some nations, evacuation protocols functioned as planned. In others, confusion and timing prevented full activation. The fate of these bunkers diverged dramatically depending on location and preparation. Facilities positioned near primary targets faced the risk of direct strike. Even reinforced bunkers can be compromised by precise nuclear warheads designed to penetrate hardened structures. Where command centers were located within major cities or military complexes, survival was uncertain. Shockwaves, ground displacement, and sustained radiation could have rendered them uninhabitable. More remote installations, carved into mountain ranges or isolated terrain, may have endured intact. In such places, continuity of government might have persisted for weeks or months after the exchange. Leadership figures within these bunkers would have monitored dwindling communication networks, attempting to assess damage and coordinate response. Yet, as outside contact faded, isolation grew. Power generation systems inside bunkers were finite. Some relied on nuclear reactors designed for long-term operation. Others depended on diesel generators with limited fuel reserves. Water recycling systems and air filtration required maintenance. If supply chains and external support vanished, even the most sophisticated bunker became a sealed chamber with an expiration date. Psychological strain within confined spaces also shaped outcomes. Leadership accustomed to command over nations found themselves restricted to narrow corridors beneath Earth. Information from the surface arrived sporadically, often contradictory. Decisions about emerging to survey the outside world carried immense risk. Radiation levels could remain lethal for extended periods. Across continents, certain governments may have attempted to re-establish control by sending reconnaissance teams to the surface. Some of those teams likely encountered devastation beyond recovery. Infrastructure reduced to ash, populations scattered or dead. In such conditions, centralized authority loses practical meaning. A bunker can preserve leadership, but it cannot rebuild society alone. There is little evidence within surviving canon that any foreign nation successfully projected post-war authority beyond its borders. This absence suggests that continuity facilities either failed, were destroyed, or remained isolated without capacity to restore national governance. Small enclaves of officials may have survived locally, transitioning from national command to regional oversight. In some regions, military bunkers may have become fortified settlements over generations. Children born underground might have grown into leaders of insular communities. Technology preserved within sealed archives could have been rationed carefully. Yet without the industrial base of an intact nation, such enclaves would remain limited in scale. The concept of sealed vaults designed for experimentation is familiar within the American wasteland, but other nations may have constructed their own variations. Civil defense shelters in major cities could have protected portions of civilian populations. However, overcrowding, limited supplies, and inadequate design likely resulted in high mortality once extended isolation set in. Mountainous regions in Europe or Asia, where hardened facilities were historically common, may still house dormant bunkers centuries later. Steel doors locked from within, generators long silent, records preserved in darkness. Some could contain descendants of original occupants, adapted to subterranean life. Others might stand empty, abandoned when supplies ran out. The tragedy of continuity planning lies in its narrow focus. These bunkers were built to preserve command, not necessarily culture. Art, community, and daily life cannot thrive indefinitely within reinforced concrete corridors. Without viable surface conditions to return to, preservation becomes prolonged waiting. 2 centuries after the bombs fell, scattered survivors across the globe may tell stories of hidden governments that endured beneath mountains. Whether myth or fragment of truth, such stories reflect a lingering hope that somewhere, authority survived intact. Yet the silence between continents suggests otherwise. If any bunker communities remain, they likely function as isolated city-states rather than global powers. Their knowledge of the wider world would be limited to initial reports and whatever exploration they dared undertake. The oceans and deserts separating continents make coordinated resurgence improbable. Beneath ruined landscapes across Europe, Asia, and beyond, steel-reinforced chambers may still rest in darkness. Some preserved their occupants for a time. Others became tombs sealed against radiation but not against depletion. In each case, the ambition to outlast apocalypse met the reality of a world too broken to command. The Great War did not only destroy cities. It tested the idea that leadership alone could ensure survival. And beneath mountains and plains across the planet, that test unfolded quietly, far from the glowing horizons that marked the end of the old world. In the first hours after the Great War, the world did not end everywhere at once. Some cities were erased in blinding light. Others were spared direct impact, only to face the slower unraveling that followed. Across continents beyond North America, the immediate aftermath varied according to distance from primary targets, wind patterns, and the presence of hardened infrastructure. Where missiles struck major capitals or military centers, destruction was absolute. Blast waves flattened neighborhoods in seconds. Fires merged into firestorms that consumed oxygen and life alike. Those who survived the initial shock faced collapsing buildings, shattered water systems, and skies darkened by rising ash. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, could not function without power or supplies. In regions not directly targeted, confusion defined the early days. News arrived fragmented. Radio transmissions crackled with reports of cities gone silent. Governments attempted to assess the scale of devastation even as their own communications failed. Citizens gathered around televisions and radios that flickered and died. Roads filled with those attempting to flee urban centers without knowing where safety lay. Electromagnetic pulse effects disrupted electrical grids across wide areas. Even countries far from ground zero experienced sudden blackouts. Without functioning infrastructure, refrigeration failed. Water pumps ceased. Modern cities, dependent on continuous energy, began to deteriorate rapidly. The absence of immediate blast did not equate to stability. Fallout patterns shaped the fate of many regions. Winds carried radioactive particles across borders, settling unpredictably. Rain transformed invisible dust into contaminated runoff. Rivers that crossed multiple nations became conduits of exposure. Agricultural land downwind of primary strike zones absorbed radiation that would affect harvests for seasons to come. In Europe, proximity between nations meant that even limited strikes produced widespread cross-contamination. Borders offered no barrier to drifting fallout. In Asia, atmospheric currents transported debris across seas, affecting coastal populations that may never have seen the flash itself. In Africa and South America, distant detonations still translated into altered climate and contaminated rainfall. The psychological impact of global annihilation cannot be understated. Populations who had grown accustomed to decades of escalating tension suddenly confronted its realization. In cities spared immediate destruction, fear alone prompted mass movement. Highways clogged with vehicles running low on fuel. Rural areas saw sudden influxes of displaced families seeking refuge. Governments that survived initial targeting attempted to impose order. Curfews were declared. Emergency rations distributed where possible. Yet the scale of infrastructure failure outpaced coordination. Without reliable communication between regions, national authority fragmented. Local officials made independent decisions, sometimes contradicting central directives. Medical systems faced unprecedented crisis. Radiation sickness manifested within days in heavily affected zones. Burns, trauma, and exposure overwhelmed clinics. Supplies of antibiotics, pain relief, and sterile equipment dwindled rapidly. In many areas, improvised care replaced organized treatment. Food scarcity emerged quickly in urban centers. Supermarkets emptied within hours. Supply chains dependent on long-distance transport ceased functioning. Those with access to rural land fared better initially, though contaminated soil threatened long-term sustainability. In tropical regions, reduced sunlight from atmospheric particulates affected crop cycles, even where radiation levels remained moderate. Transportation networks deteriorated. Airports lost control systems. Rail lines ceased operation. Ports, if not destroyed, lacked incoming vessels. The global system that once allowed rapid distribution of goods collapsed into isolated pockets of remaining stockpiles. In the weeks that followed, societies entered a transitional phase between shock and adaptation. Communities formed around available resources. In some regions, military remnants provided structure, organizing food distribution and security. In others, civil unrest emerged as scarcity deepened. Environmental consequences unfolded gradually. Smoke and particulate matter from burning cities rose into the upper atmosphere. Sunlight dimmed, temperatures shifted. Regions accustomed to predictable seasonal patterns experienced anomalies. The first winter after the war may have arrived harsher than expected in some latitudes, compounding hardship. Despite devastation, not every place was reduced to wasteland in the same manner as heavily targeted American cities. Some towns across Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia remained structurally intact, though isolated. Their survival depended less on blast resistance and more on adaptability to prolonged isolation. 2 centuries later, the immediate chaos of those first weeks is remembered only through fragmented accounts and inherited stories. Across continents, survivors would have carried memories of sirens, failing lights, and skies lit unnaturally bright. The Great War's opening hours were brief, but their consequences unfolded across generations. Beyond the familiar ruins of the Commonwealth, the first days after 2077 reshaped the rest of the world, not through uniform destruction, but through a patchwork of shock, silence, and gradual collapse. Some regions burned instantly, others faded more slowly. Yet all entered the same era defined by scarcity and separation beneath a sky permanently altered. As weeks turned into months and the first year after the Great War drew to a close, the world beyond North America entered a new phase, defined not by immediate catastrophe, but by adaptation. The initial shock of detonations gave way to the slower reality of survival beneath altered skies. Across continents, communities that endured the first wave began to reorganize around what remained. In Europe, fragmented governments struggled to maintain cohesion. Where capitals had been destroyed, regional authorities assumed control. Former provincial leaders, military commanders, and civic officials became the primary figures of order. Communication between surviving enclaves was limited to short-range radio or physical messengers traveling damaged roads. National identity, once reinforced by shared institutions, weakened as local necessity took precedence. Agricultural recovery became the central concern. Fields contaminated by fallout required time before safe cultivation could resume. In some regions, initial harvests were meager due to reduced sunlight and erratic weather patterns. Farmers experimented with crop rotation and seed preservation, drawing upon older practices that predated heavy industrial agriculture. Those efforts did not restore abundance, but they stabilized communities enough to prevent total collapse. In Asia, densely populated areas faced longer recovery periods. Urban centers that survived without direct strikes still suffered from supply shortages and infrastructure decay. Gradually, populations dispersed outward into rural areas. Former industrial districts were abandoned as scrap and salvage replaced manufacturing. Rivers and coastlines became focal points for rebuilding food sources through fishing and small-scale irrigation. Across Africa, localized governance solidified around water access and arable land. Regions less affected by direct fallout may have experienced relatively quicker stabilization. Trade between neighboring territories resumed in limited forms, often through barter. Without global markets, economies recalibrated towards subsistence and regional exchange rather than export. South America followed similar patterns. Mountainous regions in the Andes may have provided relative insulation from immediate blast, though climate shifts affected high-altitude farming. Coastal areas dependent on maritime trade faced prolonged economic contraction. Over time, smaller political entities likely emerged, defined by geography rather than former national boundaries. The absence of global communication reshaped collective understanding. Survivors in one continent had little reliable knowledge of conditions elsewhere. Rumors traveled through traders or radio transmissions that faded with distance. Stories of annihilated superpowers circulated without confirmation. In many places, the outside world became abstract, replaced by immediate local concerns. Technological regression occurred unevenly. Communities with access to preserved knowledge and limited infrastructure retained certain capabilities: basic electricity generation, mechanical repair, medical treatment. Others reverted to simpler tools and manual labor. The level of retained technology often depended on proximity to surviving institutions such as universities, military bases, or industrial centers that escaped destruction. Generational change altered perspective. Children born after 2077 did not remember the old world. They grew up under skies, sometimes dimmer, in cities partially reclaimed by vegetation. For them, pre-war global networks were stories rather than lived reality. The ambition to restore international connectivity may have seemed distant compared to immediate needs of shelter and food. In certain regions, fortified enclaves formed around former military installations or bunkers. These sites offered structural protection and sometimes independent power sources. Over decades, such enclaves could have developed into stable communities with preserved archives of pre-war knowledge. Yet, without extensive population or manufacturing capacity, their influence remained localized. Environmental systems slowly adjusted. Radioactive isotopes decayed over time, reducing contamination levels in some areas. Forests expanded into abandoned suburbs. Wildlife patterns shifted as human activity decreased. In coastal regions, fisheries gradually recovered where radiation levels diminished sufficiently. Despite this gradual stabilization, no evidence suggests that any continent achieved rapid reindustrialization capable of restoring global travel. The scale of destruction to manufacturing, energy production, and transportation networks was immense. Rebuilding such systems requires coordinated labor across wide territories, stable governance, and abundant resources, conditions difficult to achieve amid fragmentation. Centuries later, the rest of the world likely exists as a mosaic of regional societies shaped by geography and historical resilience. Some areas may resemble the American wasteland with visible ruins and scavenged technology. Others could appear less scarred, defined by rural settlements and adapted agriculture rather than towering skeletal cities. The absence of confirmed intercontinental expeditions to North America implies enduring isolation. Oceans remain formidable barriers without advanced fleets. Air travel, dependent on refined fuel and complex maintenance, likely vanished early in the aftermath. Each continent became its own sphere of recovery, bound more by memory than by active connection. Beneath quiet skies and along rivers reclaimed by reeds, humanity continued beyond the Commonwealth's horizon. The Great War fractured global unity, but it did not extinguish life everywhere. Instead, it forced a retreat into smaller circles, villages, valleys, coastal enclaves, where survival depended on cooperation more than conquest. In that retreat lies the defining characteristic of the world outside America. Not a unified post-war empire, not a coordinated resurgence, but a gradual reshaping into localized societies. The rest of the planet did not vanish. It endured quietly in countless separate places, each adapting to a future shaped by distant fire and long silence. 2 centuries after the Great War, the question of what remains beyond the American wasteland becomes less about immediate survival and more about long-term evolution. Societies that endured the initial collapse and the difficult decades that followed would have reshaped themselves in ways distinct from their pre-war identities. Without global communication or shared political structures, each continent likely developed along separate paths. In Europe, the density of pre-war population and the concentration of military targets suggest that some regions remained heavily scarred for generations. Yet not all areas were reduced to cratered ruin. Rural landscapes, less central to nuclear strategy, may have stabilized over time. Small federations of towns could have formed around arable land and freshwater sources. Ruined capitals would stand as distant reminders of a centralized authority that no longer existed. Across Asia, diversity in geography and climate would have produced varied outcomes. Coastal megacities may have remained largely uninhabitable for decades due to contamination and infrastructure collapse. Inland regions, particularly those distant from primary military targets, could have supported agrarian societies that gradually re-established regional governance. Mountain communities may have thrived relative to lowland urban centers. In Africa, the relative scarcity of direct nuclear targeting likely allowed certain areas to recover more steadily. With less extensive blast damage, communities may have retained more of their physical infrastructure. Over generations, trade between neighboring regions might have expanded gradually through overland routes, forming networks based on proximity rather than global reach. South America's trajectory may have paralleled parts of Africa. Limited direct involvement in the superpower conflict reduced immediate devastation in some areas, though economic collapse and climatic disruption still pose challenges. Agricultural regions capable of adapting to altered weather patterns could have supported growing populations once stability returned. The oceans remain the defining barrier between these evolving societies. Without industrial-scale shipbuilding and fuel refinement, transoceanic travel would have been rare. Sail-powered vessels could facilitate coastal and regional exchange, but crossing vast distances requires navigational systems and coordinated support, unlikely to be rebuilt quickly. Over 2 centuries, certain regions might have begun rediscovering aspects of advanced technology. Knowledge preserved in libraries, bunkers, or isolated institutions could be reinterpreted by later generations. Electricity generated through small-scale hydro or wind systems might illuminate parts of post-war settlements. Yet the leap from localized energy to global industry is immense. Cultural transformation accompanies technological change. Societies separated for generations develop distinct identities shaped by local experience. In Europe, legends of the Great War might blend with older histories of empire and conflict. In Asia, narratives could focus on resilience against both environmental and political upheaval. In Africa and South America, oral traditions may frame the war as a distant cataclysm imposed by external powers. The absence of organized foreign intervention in the American wasteland suggests that none of these continents achieves sufficient stability and surplus to project power overseas. Rebuilding internally would take precedence over exploring unknown shores across radioactive seas. There remains the possibility that small exploratory expeditions ventured outward at some point in the centuries following the war. A repaired vessel setting sail from a European or African coast, seeking signs of other survivors. Yet such voyages would be rare and perilous, dependent on uncertain maps and minimal communication with home settlements. The technological remnants of the old world continue to decay. Satellites have largely fallen from orbit, submarines rust on ocean floors, bunkers stand silent beneath mountains. On each continent, the landscape bears the layered marks of destruction and adaptation. Some cities remain skeletal, others have been partially reclaimed, their ruins incorporated into new construction. In this distant era, the rest of the world likely exists as a patchwork of regional societies, some stable, some fragile, none globally dominant. Their inhabitants may gaze across horizons, and wonder about lands beyond their reach, just as wastelanders in America speculate about distant continents. The Great War reshaped not only geography but imagination. It fractured the assumption of interconnected humanity. Over generations, people adapted to smaller spheres of influence and narrower definitions of community. The idea of a unified world became memory rather than reality. And yet, beneath varied climates and cultures, the core human impulse to rebuild persists. Across Europe's valleys, Asia's highlands, Africa's plains, and South America's forests, communities likely strive for continuity. They cultivate land, raise families, and pass down stories of the day the sky burned. Beyond the Commonwealth's ruins lies not emptiness, but distance, a planet divided by oceans and history, evolving in parallel rather than in concert. 2 centuries after the bombs fell, the rest of the world endures in its own quiet ways, separate, reshaped, and forever marked by the fire that once connected them all in destruction. Across the long centuries after the Great War, time itself became one of the most powerful forces shaping the rest of the world. Radiation decays, forests regrow, steel corrodes. What was once immediate catastrophe slowly transforms into altered landscape. Beyond North America, this passage of time would have softened certain scars while deepening others. In regions that endured heavy bombardment, the first decades were defined by exclusion. Cratered city centers and contaminated industrial zones remained dangerous long after fires cooled. Over generations, however, radioactive isotopes diminished. Areas once lethal became marginally habitable. Vegetation returned, first in sparse patches, then in denser growth as soil gradually stabilized. Europe's ruined capitals may now stand as hollow monuments wrapped in ivy and moss. Gothic spires rise above collapsed streets. Metro tunnels flood and become underground lakes. Wildlife moves through plazas once crowded with traffic. Human settlements, if present nearby, likely cluster at safe distances, salvaging stone and metal from structures that survived. Across Asia, similar patterns unfold. Former megacities reduced to skeletal frameworks are partially reclaimed by forest or desert depending on climate. Inland agricultural communities expand cautiously into abandoned suburbs once radiation levels fall. Over time, the visible boundary between ruined and restored becomes blurred, defined more by habitability than by former political importance. In Africa and South America, where direct targeting may have been less concentrated, urban decay follows a different course. Buildings collapse gradually due to neglect rather than blast. Infrastructure erodes without maintenance. Yet the underlying landscape, rivers, plains, mountains, remains largely intact. Communities rebuild not atop craters, but amid weathered remnants of a former global economy. The oceans also transform. Radioactive contamination disperses across currents and dilutes over decades. Coral reefs recover in some regions, especially where human activity remains low. Sunken ships become part of marine ecosystems. Coastal populations cautiously re-engage with fishing, guided by experience and observation rather than laboratory measurement. Climate patterns, altered in the immediate aftermath of the war, stabilize gradually. Nuclear winter effects diminish as atmospheric particulates settle. Temperatures return closer to pre-war norms. Though localized ecological shifts persist, forest lines move. Certain species vanish while others adapt. The natural world does not revert entirely, but it finds new equilibrium. Generational memory fades. For those living 2 centuries after the exchange, the Great War is history rather than lived trauma. Its impact is visible in ruins and inherited stories, but daily life revolves around immediate concerns, harvests, trade, governance. The world beyond one's region becomes a distant abstraction shaped by rumor and legend. Technological rediscovery progresses unevenly. Salvaged pre-war devices are studied and repurposed. Mechanical knowledge persists in regions that preserved educational materials. In isolated enclaves where archives survived intact, there may be renewed experimentation with electricity generation, metallurgy, or medicine. Yet, large-scale industrialization remains elusive without coordinated continental network. Political structures evolve organically. In Europe, clusters of settlements may form loose alliances based on shared river systems or mountain passes. In Asia, trade routes along former highways might link agricultural valleys. In Africa and South America, river corridors foster interconnected communities spanning long distances without reliance on ocean travel. The absence of regular intercontinental contact reinforces divergence. Myths surrounding distant lands grow more elaborate in the absence of verification. Stories of surviving superpowers across the sea persist, though no fleets arrive to confirm them. Ruins themselves become part of identity. In Europe, ancient castles and modern skyscrapers alike stand as layered reminders of cyclical rise and fall. In Asia, shattered neon districts transform into forests of steel and vine. In Africa and South America, abandoned ports and factories serve as quarries for new construction. Over time, certain areas, once considered peripheral, may become central to post-war life. Fertile valleys untouched by heavy fallout grow into regional hubs. Mountain strongholds with preserved knowledge become centers of governance. Coastal enclaves regain modest maritime capability using wind-powered vessels for regional trade. The planet, though scarred, does not remain frozen in its moment of destruction. It breathes, shifts, and adapts. The rest of the world beyond America evolves not toward a singular destiny, but into countless localized futures shaped by geography and resilience. 2 centuries of isolation ensure that no continent mirrors the pre-war order. Instead, each region becomes a distinct chapter in humanity's continued story. The Great War fractured global unity, yet it also forced societies to root themselves more deeply in their immediate landscapes. Beneath skies once filled with contrails and satellites, the stars now shine without interruption. Across Europe's valleys, Asia's highlands, Africa's plains, and South America's forests, communities endure within environments reshaped by time. The world did not end in a single instant. It changed and then continued, slowly, quietly, beyond the horizon of the American wasteland. Even after 2 centuries of silence between continents, the possibility of contact lingers at the edges of imagination. The oceans remain vast, but they are not infinite. If communities beyond North America endured and stabilized, it is natural to wonder whether, at some point, someone attempted to cross those waters again. Re-establishing transoceanic travel in a post-war world would require more than courage. It demands shipbuilding knowledge, reliable materials, navigational skill, and sustainable food storage. Pre-war vessels relied heavily on refined fuels and electronic systems. In a fractured world, such infrastructure is rare. Any attempt at crossing would likely begin modestly, with wind-powered ships guided by stars and inherited maritime tradition. Along the coast of Europe or West Africa, where seafaring traditions stretch back centuries, small-scale shipyards may have resumed activity long before global ambitions re-emerged. Fishing boats built from salvaged wood and repurposed metal could venture gradually farther from shore. Over generations, these vessels might grow in size and capability as craftsmanship improves. Yet the Atlantic and Pacific are unforgiving. Storm systems, unpredictable currents, and limited freshwater capacity challenge even well-equipped ships. In a world without reliable weather forecasting or rescue networks, a failed voyage means disappearance without record. The risks of such journeys would deter all but the most determined explorers. If any expedition did reach distant shores, its arrival would be transformative. Imagine a sail appearing on the horizon of the American wasteland, carrying travelers from lands long presumed silent. Language barriers, differing technologies, and centuries of separate development would complicate first contact. Mutual suspicion might outweigh curiosity. There are faint hints within scattered accounts of advanced technology appearing in unexpected places, submarines lingering offshore, foreign accents among rare travelers. Yet no confirmed narrative describes a stable, organized foreign nation establishing presence in North America. This absence suggests that either such voyages never occurred at scale, or they failed to result in sustained connection. The Pacific presents even greater challenge. Its distances dwarf those of the Atlantic. Crossing from Asia to the American West Coast requires endurance measured in months without modern navigation systems. Even if communities in Japan, Southeast Asia, or Australia rebuilt regional maritime networks, projecting across the Pacific would test resources and resolve. Isolation, once imposed by nuclear devastation, becomes self-reinforcing over time. As generations pass without confirmed contact, the urgency to reconnect may diminish. Local stability takes precedence over distant exploration. Societies invest in irrigation, defense, and internal trade rather than risking precious resources on uncertain voyages. There is also the matter of motive. Before the war, nations sought trade, alliance, and dominance across oceans. Afterward, survival redefined priorities. A settlement that has achieved modest prosperity through agriculture and regional exchange may see little advantage in confronting unknown continents rumored to be equally fractured. Still, the human impulse to explore persists. Stories told around fires in coastal villages may speak of lands across the sea, rich with salvage or danger. A young navigator might study preserved charts and wonder whether currents still flow as they once did. An old lighthouse, maintained by habit rather than necessity, might cast light into darkness in case a distant sail appears. In Europe, Africa, or South America, small exploratory voyages may have ventured outward over the centuries, mapping coastlines and rediscovering neighboring territories. Gradually, continental networks could reconnect at regional scales across the Mediterranean, along African coasts, through Southeast Asian archipelagos. Yet leapfrogging entire oceans remains a far greater endeavor. The silence between continents becomes part of cultural identity. Myths evolve about what lies beyond horizon. Some imagine thriving empires. Others envision barren wastelands mirroring their own struggles. Without confirmation, speculation replaces knowledge. 2 centuries after 2077, the world remains divided not by ideology but by distance. The Great War shattered global infrastructure. Time cemented separation. If contact ever resumes, it will not resemble pre-war diplomacy. It will be tentative, cautious, shaped by generations that grew up without memory of global unity. For now, the rest of the world and the American wasteland exist in parallel, each unaware of the full story unfolding elsewhere. Oceans that once connected now conceal, and though the possibility of reconnection lingers like a faint star over dark water, the prevailing reality is isolation. Across distant coasts, perhaps sails have risen and fallen, perhaps expeditions set out and never returned. The truth remains uncertain. What is clear is that no fleet of foreign origin has reshaped the American wasteland, and no beacon from across the sea has restored global order. The world beyond America endures in separation, and in that separation lies both safety and silence, stretching wide as the oceans themselves. When considering the rest of the world 2 centuries after the Great War, one truth remains consistent. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The American wasteland offers only fragments, rumors, relics, scattered hints. Beyond its shores, entire civilizations may persist unseen, shaped by the same catastrophe yet unfolding along separate timelines. Isolation has a powerful effect on perception. In North America, the devastation feels total because it is immediate and visible. Skyscrapers stand hollow, highways collapse into dust, yet the planet is vast. While some continents endured direct annihilation of major capitals, others may have experienced partial collapse followed by gradual stabilization. It is possible that somewhere in Europe, a coalition of surviving city-states consolidated over generations. Not a restoration of the European Union as it once existed, but a regional alliance built from necessity. Shared river systems, mountain passes, and agricultural valleys could form the backbone of new governance. Their technological level might be modest, yet sufficient for structured society. In parts of Asia, particularly inland regions less central to nuclear exchange, agrarian confederations may have emerged. Dense urban zones once dependent on global supply chains likely struggled for decades. But smaller communities, sustained by local agriculture and preserved knowledge, might have achieved stable population growth over time. Africa's varied geography suggests diverse outcomes. Certain areas may resemble rural, pre-industrial societies with selective retention of advanced tools. Others, particularly near preserved infrastructure or resource deposits, could have advanced beyond subsistence. South America, too, may host regions where climatic recovery and fertile land allowed steady rebuilding. Yet none of these hypothetical societies appear to have reached a level of global dominance or outreach capable of restoring planetary unity. The oceans remain barriers. Air travel infrastructure, once dependent on precise engineering and refined fuels, likely never fully returned at scale. Satellite networks fell silent long ago. The silence itself becomes a defining feature of post-war reality. No foreign radio broadcasts echo across American frequencies with coordinated messages. No fleet of unfamiliar design docks along its coasts. If advanced societies exist elsewhere, they either lack the means or the motive to project outward. There is also the possibility that some continents suffered more heavily than expected. Europe, densely populated and heavily militarized, may have endured near total collapse of centralized states. Asia's megacities, struck directly or indirectly, might have left vast irradiated zones limiting recovery. The absence of contact could reflect devastation rather than quiet resurgence. Even within North America, survival was uneven. Some regions resemble chaotic wastelands, others form structured polities with relative stability. It would be reasonable to assume that similar variation exists globally. The rest of the world is unlikely to be uniformly ruined or uniformly thriving. Instead, it is likely a patchwork. Time compounds divergence. 200 years of independent development ensures that any surviving societies beyond America are culturally distinct from their pre-war predecessors. Languages shift. Political systems adapt, technologies evolve differently depending on available resources and preserved knowledge. Myths about distant continents grow in the vacuum of certainty. In the American wasteland, travelers speculate about Europe reduced to radioactive marshes, or Asia dominated by unknown warlords. Without verification, imagination fills the gap. The same may be true elsewhere, where stories circulate about the land once called America, perhaps seen as cursed, perhaps as legendary. The most consistent pattern across all continents is adaptation. Humanity survives by adjusting to local conditions, whether in the ruins of London, the highlands of China, the plains of Kenya, or the forests of Brazil. Communities that endure do so by embracing smaller scales and pragmatic governance. The Great War shattered the illusion of a connected globe. In its place emerged parallel histories, unfolding beyond each horizon. Each continent carries its own version of 2077. Each bears scars, both visible and hidden. From the perspective of the Commonwealth or the Mojave, the rest of the world feels unknowable. That uncertainty is itself a consequence of global fracture. It severed the shared narrative of humanity, and yet, Somewhere beneath different constellations and across distant seas, people likely look up at the same night sky. They cultivate land, they teach children, they salvage remnants of the old world and reinterpret them through new generations. The question of what happened to the rest of the world may never have a singular answer. It is not one story, but many, some marked by ruin, others by cautious recovery, all shaped by the same moment of fire. Beyond America's borders, the world persists in silence, not erased, not unified, but continuing quietly, separately across continents, once bound together by trade and ambition, now divided by distance and time. When all speculation is set aside, what remains most consistent about the rest of the world after the Great War is uncertainty. The absence of clear evidence does not imply total ruin, nor does it confirm quiet prosperity. It suggests distance, physical, technological, and historical. 2 centuries is enough time for civilizations to fall and new ones to rise. It is enough time for languages to shift and borders to fade. It is enough time for children born into post-war hardship to become elders in stabilized communities. Beyond the American wasteland, such cycles have likely unfolded in countless forms. In Europe, regions once divided by ideology may now be united simply by necessity. River valleys that once marked political borders could function as shared lifelines. Ruined industrial centers might serve as quarries for new construction rather than reminders of lost ambition. Governance, if present, would reflect local realities rather than inherited empires. Across Asia, the immense scale of geography ensures varied outcomes. Coastal ruins, mountain enclaves, fertile plains all respond differently to devastation and recovery. Some areas may resemble fragmented city-states, trading modest goods across short distances. Others might remain sparsely populated, defined more by environment than by human structure. Africa and South America, with their broad rural expanses, may have retained stronger agricultural foundations. While global trade collapsed, subsistence practices rooted in local knowledge could sustain populations long enough for gradual rebuilding. Over generations, stable regional networks may have formed, though not necessarily with the capacity for intercontinental outreach. The oceans remain the defining boundary. Without advanced industry, crossing them safely is rare. Sail-powered vessels could navigate coasts and neighboring territories, but spanning entire oceans requires sustained coordination. The silence between continents therefore persists, not because life ended elsewhere, but because connection did. Within North America, stories of foreign powers sometimes surface rumors of advanced submarines or distant accents, yet none culminate in lasting presence. If organized states exist beyond the sea, they have neither intervened nor established colonies. Their priorities likely mirror those of American factions: survival, consolidation, gradual recovery. Time also reshapes ruins. Radiation fades unevenly. Forests reclaim highways. Buildings collapse into manageable debris. In some distant continent, a former metropolis might now support small communities within its outer districts, its inner core left as a silent memorial. Elsewhere, cities may have been abandoned entirely, with populations relocating to more stable terrain. The rest of the world is unlikely to be uniform in its fate. Some regions may be harsher than the American wasteland, suffering from concentrated strikes or prolonged nuclear winter. Others may be comparatively stable, having avoided heavy targeting and benefited from adaptable agriculture. Diversity of outcome is more plausible than a single global condition. Perhaps the most profound transformation is cultural. Generations born long after 2077 would not identify themselves as remnants of a pre-war nation. They would see themselves as citizens of whatever settlement or alliance now governs their lives. Pre-war geopolitics becomes distant history, fragmented and reinterpreted. Myths fill the vacuum left by absence of data. In Europe, tales may circulate about the land across the ocean where vaults preserved entire communities. In Asia, Stories might warn of irradiated continents where warlords roam beneath perpetual dust. These narratives, though unverified, shape identity and caution. The Great War did not produce a singular global wasteland. It produced countless local realities, each defined by geography, resources, and resilience. Beyond the American horizon lies a planet still inhabited, still evolving, but disconnected. If one truth can be drawn from the silence, it is this: the rest of the world did not vanish in an instant. It endured, fractured, and reshaped. Its people adapted beneath dimmed skies, just as those in the Commonwealth did. And so the question of what happened beyond America does not resolve into a single image of ruin or recovery. It resolves into distance. Across oceans and generations, the world persists in parallel, its fate intertwined with, but no longer synchronized to the land once known as the United States. In the end, the rest of the world after the Great War is defined not by a single catastrophe, but by divergence. When the missiles fell in 2077, they struck key centers of power, industry, and military command. Yet the planet is vast, and devastation, though immense, was not evenly distributed. Some regions burned in moments, others dimmed more slowly beneath drifting fallout and failing infrastructure. 2 centuries later, what lies beyond the American wasteland is neither a unified empire nor an empty void. It is likely a mosaic of fractured societies shaped by geography and memory. Europe may hold ruined capitals surrounded by cautious regional alliances. Asia may host inland enclaves that rebuilt through agriculture and salvaged knowledge. Africa and South America may contain communities that adapted through subsistence and gradual trade. The oceans remain wide and largely untraveled. Without advanced industry and coordinated fleets, crossing them is rare. It reflects the cost and risk of reconnection in a world still healing from fire. Satellites have fallen silent. Bunkers beneath mountains may stand empty or house isolated descendants of former officials. Submarines rust on sea floors, yet forests regrow, rivers flow, and new generations rise without direct memory of the day the sky ignited. The Great War severed global unity, but it did not erase humanity, it scattered it. Beyond the horizon, beneath unfamiliar constellations, people likely continue to build, cultivate, and govern within smaller circles of trust. Their histories diverge from America's, shaped by local challenges and inherited resilience. What happened to the rest of the world is not a single answer waiting to be uncovered. It is countless quiet continuations unfolding in parallel, and across distant seas, separated by time and silence, the planet endures scarred, altered, yet still alive beneath the same wide sky. And so, as the night settles in and the ruins of the Commonwealth fade from view, the rest of the world remains just beyond reach, not erased, not fully revealed, but distant. Across Europe's valleys, Asia's coastlines, Africa's plains, and South America's forests, life likely continues in forms shaped by the same fire that scarred America. The Great War was global, but its aftermath was uneven. Some cities vanished in light, others endured in shadow. Oceans widened not in miles, but in silence. 2 centuries have passed, enough time for forests to reclaim streets and for children to grow old without ever knowing a connected world. What happened beyond America is not a single story. It is 1,000 local histories unfolding in isolation. Beneath dimmer skies and quieter horizons, communities adapt, rebuild, and remember in their own ways. And somewhere, across dark water and distant shores, other survivors may look up at the same stars, wondering what became of this land in return.